You think you need to be strong and bury your emotional wounds to move forward? But Buddha taught the opposite over 2,500 years ago. Your wounds don't need to be hidden. They need to be seen with compassion. You've carried this heavy pain for far too long, trying to run from it, push it away, pretend it doesn't exist. Buddhist monks know that healing doesn't come from strength. It comes from gentleness. When you stop resisting and simply observe your pain with mindful awareness, something profound happens. The wound begins to dissolve on its own. It's not magic. It's ancient wisdom applied to your modern suffering. Your pain wants to teach you something, not destroy you. Prepare to sleep while listening to this video. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment from which part of the world you are watching. Get comfortable and relax. Let's begin. Have you ever noticed how some ancient wisdom seems perfectly tailored to address our modern emotional struggles? That's exactly what happens with the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism when applied to emotional healing. These foundational teachings offer a remarkably clear roadmap for understanding and transforming our deepest emotional wounds. The Four Noble Truths begin with a straightforward acknowledgement that suffering exists. This might seem obvious, but in a culture that often encourages us to mask pain with positive thinking or distraction, simply acknowledging that emotional suffering is real and valid represents a powerful first step. The Buddha wasn't suggesting that life is only suffering, but rather honestly recognizing that pain, disappointment, and emotional wounds are unavoidable aspects of human experience. When we apply this to emotional healing, it gives us permission to acknowledge our wounds without shame. Instead of thinking something has gone terribly wrong when we experience emotional pain, we can recognize it as part of the shared human condition. This recognition isn't meant to be depressing, but liberating. Many people carry emotional wounds for years, spending enormous energy denying their existence or pretending to be fine. The First Noble Truth encourages us to drop this exhausting pretense. Imagine the relief of finally admitting, "Yes, I am hurting," without immediately needing to fix it or explain it away. This honest acknowledgement creates the necessary foundation for all genuine emotional healing. The Second Noble Truth goes deeper by exploring where emotional suffering comes from. According to this teaching, the root cause of our distress isn't the painful events themselves, but our relationship to those events. Specifically, suffering arises from craving and aversion, wanting things to be different than they are, clinging to what we want, and rejecting what we don't want. When applied to emotional wounds, this offers profound insight into why some painful experiences develop into lasting trauma while others don't. For instance, many emotional wounds stem from experiences that contradicted our deep expectations about how life should be. The child who expected protection but experienced neglect. The partner who expected fidelity but faced betrayal. The worker who expected recognition but received criticism. In each case, the gap between expectation and reality creates a wound that's perpetuated by continued resistance to what happened. The Second Noble Truth doesn't blame us for having these expectations, but compassionately explains how they contribute to our ongoing suffering. This understanding shifts our perspective on emotional healing. Rather than seeing our wounds as permanent damage that must be endlessly processed, we can begin to recognize how our current relationship with painful experiences keeps wounds fresh. Often, we perpetuate emotional suffering through stories we repeat about what happened, how it shouldn't have happened, and what it means about us or others. These stories, while seemingly protective, actually keep us bound to the past. The Third Noble Truth offers something revolutionary, the promise that complete liberation from emotional suffering is possible. This isn't suggesting we can avoid painful feelings altogether, but rather that we can relate to them in a way that doesn't create additional layers of distress. The Buddha called this liberation nirvana, which literally means extinguishing, not the extinguishing of emotions themselves, but of the reactive patterns that transform natural emotional responses into ongoing anguish. This teaching counteracts the common belief that emotional wounds never fully heal, that we can at best hope to manage them. Instead, it suggests that through the right practice and understanding, even our deepest emotional wounds can transform. We don't have to remain forever defined by past hurts. The possibility of complete healing exists not because painful memories disappear, but because our relationship to them fundamentally changes. The Fourth Noble Truth provides the practical pathway for this transformation through the Eightfold Path: right understanding, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. This comprehensive approach addresses every aspect of how we relate to our emotional experiences. It's not a quick fix, but a holistic reorientation of how we live. For emotional healing specifically, certain aspects of the Eightfold Path prove especially transformative. Right understanding helps us see our emotional patterns clearly without judgment, recognizing how we've been unknowingly maintaining our own suffering. Right mindfulness teaches us to stay present with painful emotions rather than avoiding them, allowing them to process naturally. Right effort shows us how to work with difficult emotions skillfully, neither suppressing nor indulging them. The beauty of this approach is its integration of compassion and wisdom. The Four Noble Truths don't ask us to simply analyze our emotional wounds intellectually or just be kind to ourselves. They show how these elements work together. Compassion without wisdom can enable unhelpful patterns. Wisdom without compassion can become cold detachment. True emotional healing requires both. What makes this framework so effective for emotional healing is its middle path between extremes. It avoids both the harsh self-judgment that says we should just get over emotional wounds and the tendency to define ourselves permanently by our wounds. Instead, it offers a compassionate but clear-eyed approach to transformation. The practical application involves gradually bringing awareness to our emotional patterns, particularly noticing how we create additional suffering through resistance, identification, and reactivity. As we develop this awareness, we naturally begin responding differently to emotional triggers. What once launched us into days of distress might still cause pain, but without the cascading reaction that amplifies and prolongs suffering. This process unfolds over time as we practice working with our emotions in new ways. Small shifts gradually create profound changes. The person who once felt defined by abandonment begins to experience moments of secure presence. The individual trapped in self-criticism starts finding spaces of self-compassion. These aren't temporary states achieved through force of will, but natural developments as the underlying patterns shift. The Four Noble Truths remind us that emotional healing isn't about achieving a perfect life without difficulties, but about relating to life's inevitable challenges with greater wisdom and compassion. When fully embodied, this approach doesn't just heal specific wounds, but transforms our entire relationship with emotional experience, bringing a sense of spaciousness and freedom even amidst life's ongoing challenges. Understanding dukkha, suffering, in the context of emotional wounds, everyone knows what it feels like to hurt emotionally. But understanding the Buddhist concept of dukkha offers a perspective on emotional wounds that goes much deeper than our everyday notion of suffering. This understanding can completely transform how we relate to our deepest emotional pain. Dukkha is often translated simply as suffering, but this translation misses much of its richness and depth. More accurately, dukkha encompasses dissatisfaction, stress, unease, and the inherent unsatisfactoriness that pervades human experience, even during seemingly pleasant times. It's the background hum of something's not quite right that can persist regardless of our circumstances. When we apply this broader understanding of dukkha to our emotional wounds, something interesting happens. We start to see that specific traumas and hurts exist within a larger context of human experience. Our individual wounds, whether from childhood neglect, relationship betrayals, losses, failures, or other painful experiences, are particular manifestations of this universal human condition. This doesn't diminish the very real pain of specific wounds. Instead, It helps us recognize that our emotional suffering isn't just about particular events that happen to us, but also about how we as humans are constructed to experience and process those events. We're built with nervous systems that register threats intensely, minds that create and cling to stories about what happened, and hearts that long for things to be different than they are. The Buddha observed that most people respond to dukkha in one of two unhelpful ways, either by desperately trying to escape it through endless seeking of pleasurable distractions or by resigning themselves to it fatalistically. With emotional wounds specifically, we see these same patterns play out. Some people run from their pain through workaholism, substance use, or constant busyness. Others collapse into their wounds, identifying completely with them and seeing no possibility beyond suffering. The Buddhist approach offers a middle path. It suggests that the way beyond suffering isn't through avoiding it or becoming it, but by turning toward it with clear awareness and compassion. This approach is radically different from how we typically handle emotional wounds in modern society, where we're often encouraged to move on quickly or conversely to endlessly process our trauma stories. One of the most liberating aspects of understanding dukkha is recognizing that resistance to emotional pain actually intensifies it. When we fight against difficult emotions, thinking, "I shouldn't feel this way," or "this pain needs to stop immediately," we create a secondary layer of suffering on top of the original pain. It's like being shot with one arrow, the initial emotional wound, and then shooting ourselves with a second arrow, our resistance to that wound. This insight from the Buddha remains remarkably relevant to contemporary emotional healing. Much of what keeps old wounds fresh is our continued resistance to having experienced them. The adult who still carries childhood hurt isn't just suffering from what happened decades ago, but from an ongoing unwillingness to fully accept that this was part of their life experience. This isn't about condoning harmful actions, but about ceasing to fight reality itself. Another powerful dimension of understanding dukkha involves recognizing that our emotional wounds aren't as solid or permanent as they appear. The Buddha taught that all phenomena, including our most painful emotional states, are impermanent and without solid essence. Our wounds feel like concrete realities, but they're actually dynamic processes, constellations of physical sensations, thoughts, memories, and energy that flow and change moment by moment. When we look closely at emotional pain through meditation, we often discover that what seemed like a solid block of suffering is actually a complex, changing experience. There might be tightness in the chest, heat in the face, particular thoughts that come and go, images that flash in the mind, all arising and passing in an ongoing flow. This microscopic view doesn't negate the reality of our pain, but helps us relate to it with more spaciousness and less identification. The Buddha also taught that our sense of having a fixed, separate self that is wounded is itself part of the problem. We tend to create identities around our emotional wounds. I am a trauma survivor. I am someone with abandonment issues. I am broken. While these labels can initially help us understand and validate our experiences, they can eventually become limiting prisons that keep us stuck in particular ways of seeing ourselves and the world. Understanding dukkha helps us recognize that while our wounds happen to us personally, they aren't personal in the sense of signaling something uniquely wrong with us. Emotional pain is part of the human operating system, not a sign of failure or fundamental brokenness. This realization can be profoundly freeing, especially for those who've carried shame about their emotional struggles. The Buddhist approach to emotional wounds isn't about achieving a perfect state where nothing hurts anymore. Rather, it's about developing a wiser relationship with the inevitability of pain in human life. This relationship includes both profound acceptance of what is and the understanding that our relationship to pain can transform radically, even when the memories themselves remain. What makes this approach so powerful for emotional healing is that it addresses suffering at its roots rather than just managing symptoms. Instead of merely developing coping strategies for emotional pain, We learn to see through the fundamental misunderstandings that make that pain so overwhelming and seemingly permanent. This doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone, but through direct experiential insight developed through practices like meditation. The paradox of this approach is that fully acknowledging the reality of dukkha doesn't lead to pessimism or resignation, but to its opposite. When we stop spending energy fighting against the existence of emotional pain, tremendous vitality becomes available. Many who deeply engage with Buddhist practice report a profound sense of relief and freedom, even while still experiencing the full range of human emotions. This understanding translates into practical approaches for working with emotional wounds, rather than trying to analyze them endlessly or push them away. We learn to create a compassionate space where they can be felt fully in the body, observed with mindful awareness, and allowed to move through us without defining us. We develop the capacity to hold even intense emotional pain within a larger field of awareness that isn't consumed by it. Through this process, our relationship with emotional wounds gradually transforms. What once seemed like permanent damage to our being reveals itself as part of a much larger, flowing experience of being human. The wounds don't necessarily disappear, but they no longer confine us. We find ourselves able to experience emotional pain when it arises without being defined by it or driven to escape it at all costs. Understanding dukkha ultimately leads us toward greater freedom, not because it eliminates painful experiences from life, but because it changes our relationship to those experiences so fundamentally that they no longer have the power to trap us in patterns of ongoing suffering. This freedom becomes the foundation for a life that can embrace the full spectrum of human experience with an open heart. Understanding dukkha ultimately leads us toward greater freedom, not because it eliminates painful experiences from life, but because it changes our relationship to those experiences so fundamentally that they no longer have the power to trap us in patterns of ongoing suffering. This freedom becomes the foundation for a life that can embrace the full spectrum of human experience with an open heart. This transformation in our relationship with suffering doesn't happen automatically just by understanding Buddhist concepts intellectually. It requires practical tools and consistent practice. This is where mindfulness meditation becomes invaluable as a direct method for developing emotional awareness and resilience. Mindfulness meditation is essentially a training in conscious attention, learning to be fully present with whatever is happening in our experience without judgment or resistance. While many people associate meditation with relaxation or positive feelings, its deeper purpose in Buddhism is to develop clear seeing. This clear seeing becomes particularly powerful when applied to our emotional landscape. Most of us have deeply ingrained habits of either pushing difficult emotions away or becoming completely identified with them. When sadness, anger, fear, or shame arise, we typically react automatically rather than responding skillfully. Mindfulness meditation disrupts these automatic reactions by creating a small but crucial space between the emotional trigger and our response. The practice itself is deceptively simple. We begin by anchoring our attention in a neutral object like the breath or body sensations. When emotions arise, as they inevitably will, we learn to acknowledge them with awareness rather than either suppressing or amplifying them. With regular practice, we develop the capacity to stay present with increasingly intense emotional states without being overwhelmed. What makes mindfulness so revolutionary for emotional healing is that it allows us to experience emotions fully without being controlled by them. Consider how different this is from our usual approaches. Typically, when painful emotions connected to old wounds arise, we either try to analyze them intellectually, push them away through distraction, or get swept away in their storylines. Mindfulness offers a middle path, feeling emotions directly in the body while maintaining enough awareness to avoid being submerged by them. As we practice mindfulness regularly, we begin to notice something profound about emotions. They're constantly changing. An emotion that seemed overwhelming and solid when we were caught in it reveals itself, under the microscope of mindful attention, to be a flowing process of physical sensations. mental images, and thoughts. This direct perception of the impermanent nature of emotions gradually loosens their grip on us. Another crucial insight that emerges through mindfulness practice is that we are not our emotions. While this might sound obvious intellectually, most of us live as though our emotions define us. When anger arises, "I am angry" becomes our reality. When fear takes over, "I am afraid" seems like the whole truth of who we are. Mindfulness helps us recognize that emotions are events happening within the field of our awareness, rather than our fundamental identity. This shift in perspective, from being emotions to witnessing them, creates tremendous freedom in relation to emotional wounds. The person who is always identified as someone with anxiety begins to recognize anxiety as just one passing experience among many, not the core of their being. The individual who has felt defined by grief starts to experience moments of spacious awareness that can hold grief without being consumed by it. The neuroscience behind mindfulness supports its effectiveness for emotional healing. Research has shown that regular mindfulness practice actually changes brain structure and function in areas related to emotional regulation. The prefrontal cortex, which helps modulate emotional reactions, strengthens its connections with the amygdala, our brain's alarm system. This allows us to respond to emotional triggers with greater flexibility rather than through automatic fight, flight, or freeze reactions. Practically speaking, mindfulness for emotional healing doesn't require hours of formal meditation daily. Even short, regular practices can develop the neural pathways that support emotional awareness. Starting with just 10 minutes each day of sitting quietly and observing breath and body sensations builds the foundation. When emotions arise during practice, we learn to turn toward them with curious attention rather than away in aversion. This skill then gradually extends beyond formal practice into daily life. Someone might notice anxiety arising while stuck in traffic and be able to recognize anxiety is present rather than becoming anxiety. They might feel the physical sensations of tightness in the chest and shallow breathing without being compelled to act from the anxiety or push it away. This capacity to be with emotional experience without being driven by it creates space for new responses. For deep emotional wounds, specifically, mindfulness offers a path for processing stuck emotions that may have been held in the body and psyche for years. Many trauma experts now recognize that traumatic experiences create patterns of activation in the nervous system that can persist long after the threatening event has passed. Mindfulness provides a way to safely experience and release these patterns by approaching them in small doses with present moment awareness. The approach involves learning to stay grounded in present moment body awareness while gently acknowledging difficult emotions as they arise, rather than diving directly into traumatic memories, which can be overwhelming. Mindfulness teaches us to notice when we're becoming activated and to anchor attention in present safety, feeling our feet on the ground, noticing our surroundings, following our breath. From this stable foundation, we can gradually increase our capacity to be with difficult emotions. What's particularly powerful about mindfulness for emotional healing is that it works with emotions at the level of direct experience rather than just through conceptual understanding. While insight about the origins of our emotional patterns is valuable, healing ultimately happens through experiencing emotions differently, not just thinking about them differently. Mindfulness brings us into direct contact with the living reality of our emotions as they manifest in real time. The practice also helps us recognize how we perpetuate emotional suffering through stories and judgments. We might have an initial wave of sadness that lasts 30 seconds, but then extend it for hours or days through narratives like, "This always happens to me," or "I'll never feel better." Mindfulness helps us distinguish between primary emotions and these secondary reactions, allowing the initial emotion to process naturally without the added layers. As mindfulness develops, we discover that even very difficult emotions become workable when approached with awareness. This doesn't mean we never feel intense emotions. Rather, we develop confidence in our capacity to be present with whatever arises. This confidence itself becomes a powerful healing force, as many emotional wounds are perpetuated precisely by our fear of feeling certain emotions fully. Through consistent practice, mindfulness gradually transforms our entire relationship with our emotional life. We move from being victims of our emotional reactions to becoming wise observers who can respond skillfully to the full range of human feelings. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but even small steps in this direction create significant changes in our experience of emotional wounds. This capacity for mindful awareness provides the foundation for another powerful Buddhist practice for emotional healing, loving kindness or metta meditation. While mindfulness develops our ability to see emotions clearly, metta cultivation addresses the heart's orientation toward ourselves and our experiences, especially in times of difficulty. Loving kindness practice might be the most direct antidote we have for the self-criticism, shame, and harsh judgment that often accompany emotional wounds. Many people carry not only the original wounds from difficult life experiences, but an additional layer of self-blame about how they've responded to or been affected by these experiences. Thoughts like, "I should be over this by now," or "there must be something wrong with me for feeling this way," compound the suffering of the original wound. Metta practice works directly with these patterns by systematically cultivating an attitude of kindness and well-wishing toward ourselves and others. The practice typically begins with directing loving kindness toward ourselves, precisely because this is often the most challenging direction and the one most needed for emotional healing. From there, the practice gradually expands to include others, loved ones, neutral people, difficult people, and eventually all beings. The formal practice involves repeating simple phrases such as, "May I be happy," "May I be peaceful," "May I be safe," "May I live with ease." We direct these wishes toward ourselves while noticing any resistance that arises. For many people, especially those with deep emotional wounds, self-directed kindness initially feels foreign, uncomfortable, or even threatening. The practice isn't about forcing warm feelings, but about setting a clear intention of friendliness toward ourselves, regardless of what emotions actually arise. What makes loving kindness practice so powerful for healing emotional wounds is that it directly counteracts the harsh self-judgment that keeps wounds festering. Many of us have internalized critical voices from caregivers, society, or our own defensive patterns. These voices often tell us we're fundamentally flawed, unworthy, or unlovable. Metta practice doesn't try to argue intellectually with these beliefs, but instead establishes a different relationship with ourselves through consistent, intentional well-wishing. The practice works at multiple levels simultaneously. On one level, it's a deliberate cultivation of positive emotion that can counterbalance the negative bias many of us develop, especially after painful experiences. Research shows that regular loving-kindness practice actually changes our baseline emotional state, making positive emotions more accessible even in difficult circumstances. On a deeper level, metta practice addresses the fundamental sense of unworthiness or inadequacy that often underlies emotional wounds. Many people carry a core belief that they're somehow defective or undeserving of compassion. These beliefs usually operate below conscious awareness, but powerfully shape how we interpret and respond to life events. Regular loving-kindness practice gradually softens these core beliefs not by directly challenging them, but by establishing a new pattern of relating to ourselves. For self-forgiveness, specifically, metta practice offers a systematic approach. Many people struggling with self-forgiveness try to force it through rational thinking, telling themselves they should forgive themselves. This rarely works because forgiveness is ultimately an emotional shift, not just an intellectual decision. Metta practice creates the emotional conditions where self-forgiveness can naturally emerge by cultivating a basic attitude of goodwill toward ourselves regardless of past actions or perceived failings. The practice becomes particularly powerful when directed toward the specific aspects of ourselves that we find most difficult to accept. We might focus loving kindness on the part of us that made a serious mistake, the part that still feels intense grief, or the part that carries shame, rather than trying to get rid of these aspects of our experience. We learn to hold them in a larger field of kindness and inclusion. This approach reflects the Buddhist understanding that true healing comes not from eliminating parts of ourselves, but from changing our relationship to all aspects of our experience. The parts of us that carry emotional wounds aren't problems to be fixed, but aspects of our humanity that need attention and care. Metta practice provides that care in a direct and systematic way. What many practitioners discover through regular loving-kindness practice is that self-compassion isn't selfish or self-indulgent, but actually creates the foundation for genuine connection with others. When we're harsh with ourselves, we tend to project that harshness outward, judging others by the same impossible standards. As we develop more kindness toward our own wounds and struggles, we naturally extend that same understanding to others facing similar challenges. This ripple effect of compassion is particularly healing for wounds related to relationships, as many emotional wounds are. The person who can meet their own loneliness with kindness becomes more capable of genuine connection with others. The individual who can forgive themselves for mistakes becomes more able to forgive others. What begins as a practice directed toward personal healing ultimately creates the conditions for healing our relationships as well. The neurological impact of loving-kindness practice is well documented. Regular practice activates and strengthens brain regions associated with positive emotions, empathy, and connection. It reduces activity in the default mode network associated with rumination and self-criticism. These changes create a neurological environment conducive to emotional healing by literally rewiring the brain's habitual patterns. The neurological impact of loving-kindness practice is well documented. Regular practice activates and strengthens brain regions associated with positive emotions, empathy, and connection. It reduces activity in the default mode network associated with rumination and self-criticism. These changes create a neurological environment conducive to emotional healing by literally rewiring the brain's habitual patterns. While loving-kindness practice helps us develop a gentler relationship with ourselves and our emotional wounds, there's another Buddhist teaching that offers profound insight into why we suffer emotionally in the first place. This is the principle of impermanence, or anicca in Pali. Understanding impermanence doesn't just give us philosophical perspective, it can radically transform our relationship with emotional pain that seems fixed and permanent. Impermanence is one of the three marks of existence in Buddhist teaching, along with suffering, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. It points to the fact that everything in our experience, from physical objects to bodily sensations, thoughts, emotions, and relationships, is in constant flux. Nothing remains the same from moment to moment, though our minds create the illusion of solidity and permanence. Most of us intellectually accept that everything changes. We see seasons shift, children grow, technologies evolve. But emotionally, we often live as though our identities, relationships, and circumstances should remain stable. This disconnect between reality, constant change, and expectation, stability, creates tremendous suffering, especially around emotional wounds. Consider how emotional wounds often feel permanent. Someone who experienced childhood neglect might carry a sense of unworthiness that feels like an unchangeable fact about who they are. A person who went through a painful divorce might feel that their heartbreak is a permanent condition. These wounds take on a quality of solidity in our minds, as if they're etched in stone rather than being dynamic processes that can transform. The Buddhist perspective on impermanence challenges this solidity directly. It invites us to look more closely at what we think of as fixed emotional damage and see its changing nature. Through mindfulness practice, we can observe how emotions that seem permanent are actually constantly shifting constellations of bodily sensations, thoughts, and energy. Even deep-seated emotional patterns reveal themselves as processes rather than fixed entities when examined with careful attention. This isn't just philosophical hair-splitting, it has profound implications for emotional healing. When we truly understand impermanence, we stop relating to emotional wounds as permanent fixtures of our identity. Instead, we begin to see them as conditioned patterns that arose due to certain causes and conditions, and that can change under new conditions. This shift in perspective opens possibilities for transformation that weren't available when we viewed our wounds as fixed aspects of who we are. Impermanence also helps us understand why emotional attachment intensifies suffering. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from clinging to what is inherently impermanent. This clinging takes many forms, wanting pleasant experiences to last forever, wanting unpleasant experiences to never occur, or wanting things to be different than they actually are. When we don't accept the changing nature of experience, we create tension against reality itself. With emotional wounds, specifically, we often develop complex patterns of clinging. We might cling to identities built around our wounds. I'm a trauma survivor. I'm broken. I'm the one who was betrayed. We might cling to narratives about what happened and what it means. We might even cling to the familiar pain itself, as it becomes a known territory compared to the uncertainty of healing and change. Understanding impermanence helps us recognize these patterns of attachment and begin loosening their hold. It doesn't mean we dismiss our emotional wounds or try to rush their healing. Rather, we begin relating to them with more spaciousness, recognizing that even long-standing emotional patterns are subject to change and transformation. This principle also helps us work with the emotional impact of actual losses and endings in life. Many emotional wounds stem from experiences of loss, the death of loved ones, the end of relationships, the loss of health, opportunities, or dreams. These losses hurt precisely because we're attached to what was lost, often wishing desperately that things could have remained as they were. The Buddhist perspective doesn't suggest we shouldn't care about these losses or feel their impact. Instead, it offers a way of relating to loss that acknowledges pain while reducing unnecessary suffering. By understanding that everything is in constant change, we can hold our attachments more lightly. We still love, connect, and engage fully, but without the desperate clinging that assumes things should remain unchanged. Practically speaking, working with impermanence for emotional healing involves several approaches. First, through meditation, we develop the ability to observe how emotional states naturally arise and pass when not interfered with. We might sit for 20 minutes and notice sadness emerge, intensify, shift, and eventually transform into something else entirely. This direct observation helps us trust the changing nature of even difficult emotions. Second, we can deliberately contemplate impermanence in daily life, noticing how everything is constantly changing, from the weather to our physical sensations, thoughts, and relationships. This broader awareness of change helps contextualize our emotional wounds within the greater flow of life rather than seeing them as exceptions to a rule of stability. Third, we can examine our language and thoughts about emotional wounds, noticing when we're using fixed, permanent-sounding descriptions. I am damaged. I will always feel this way. This has ruined me forever. Simply recognizing these thoughts as thoughts rather than facts creates space for different possibilities. What many practitioners discover is that truly understanding impermanence doesn't lead to detachment from life, but to a more authentic engagement. When we stop expecting permanent happiness or trying to create unchanging security, we can be more fully present with the constantly changing flow of experience. We can allow ourselves to feel joy without desperately trying to make it last forever. And we can face difficulties knowing they too will transform. For emotional wounds specifically, the recognition of impermanence offers hope without false promises. It doesn't claim that severe trauma will simply disappear overnight, but it does challenge the belief that we are permanently defined by our wounds. It suggests that with the right conditions, awareness, compassion, appropriate support, even the deepest emotional patterns can gradually transform. This understanding of impermanence naturally connects with another powerful Buddhist practice for emotional healing, the cultivation of compassion, or karuna. While loving kindness, metta, focuses on wishing well-being for ourselves and others, compassion specifically responds to suffering with a wish to relieve it. This quality becomes especially important when working with the wounds of past traumas. Compassion in Buddhism is not the same as pity, which often contains elements of judgment or distance. True compassion combines clear seeing of suffering with genuine care and a wish to alleviate it. It acknowledges pain without turning away, while maintaining faith in the possibility of relief and transformation. This balanced approach makes compassion particularly well suited for healing trauma, which requires both acknowledgement of genuine harm and belief in the possibility of recovery. When directed toward our own traumatic experiences, compassion helps create an internal environment where healing becomes possible. Many trauma survivors develop harsh relationships with themselves, carrying shame, self-blame, or disgust about what happened or how they responded. These judgmental attitudes compound the original trauma and make healing more difficult. Compassion practice directly counteracts these patterns by cultivating a kind, supportive internal presence. The practice typically begins with acknowledging suffering that exists, rather than minimizing or avoiding awareness of pain from past traumas. We gently turn toward it with an attitude of care. We might use phrases like, "this is painful," or "this suffering is real," to validate our experience without judgment. This simple acknowledgement can be profoundly healing, especially for those whose pain was previously denied or dismissed by others or by themselves. Next, compassion practice involves recognizing our shared humanity. Trauma often creates a sense of isolation, feeling fundamentally different from others or permanently damaged in ways others couldn't understand. Compassion practice counters this isolation by recognizing that suffering is part of the human experience. While each person's specific traumas are unique, the experience of being wounded and struggling to heal connects us with countless others throughout time. From this recognition of shared humanity, we develop the wish for relief from suffering. This isn't a passive wish, but an active stance that aligns our intentions and actions toward healing. For trauma healing specifically, compassion helps us take appropriate steps toward care, whether seeking therapeutic support, creating safety in our lives, or learning skills for working with traumatic symptoms. Compassion practice becomes especially powerful when directed toward the specific parts of ourselves that carry traumatic wounds. Using an approach sometimes called parts work, we can learn to relate to wounded aspects of our psyche as if they were wounded children or parts of ourselves that need care rather than criticism. This internal relationship of compassion creates safety that allows traumatic experiences to be processed and integrated rather than remaining frozen or fragmented. Neurologically, cultivating compassion activates different systems in the brain than those typically activated by trauma. While traumatic memories often trigger fight-flight-freeze responses in the amygdala and sympathetic nervous system, compassion activates systems associated with care, safety, and social connection. This physiological shift creates conditions where trauma can be approached without triggering overwhelming reactions or dissociation. Research in interpersonal neurobiology suggests that compassion from others plays a crucial role in healing developmental trauma specifically. Many early wounds occur in relationships and become encoded in implicit memory before we have language or conscious recall. These wounds often require new relational experiences of safety, attunement, and compassion to heal. By cultivating self-compassion, we begin providing internally what may have been missing externally for those whose trauma involved harm from others. Compassion practice eventually extends to the difficult work of relating wisely to perpetrators. This doesn't mean excusing harmful actions or forcing premature forgiveness. Rather, it involves seeing the complex conditions that lead humans to cause harm, their own woundedness, ignorance, and conditioning. This broader perspective helps reduce the grip of hatred or revenge that can keep trauma survivors emotionally bound to those who harmed them. The practice of compassion also helps address the societal dimensions of trauma. Many traumatic experiences occur within contexts of systemic injustice, oppression, or violence. Compassion practice helps us hold awareness of these broader conditions without becoming overwhelmed or resigned. It fuels constructive engagement with creating safer, more just communities while preventing burnout or despair. What many practitioners discover is that compassion has a wisdom component that distinguishes it from mere sentiment. True compassion doesn't just feel sorry for suffering, but sees clearly what is needed for healing. Sometimes this means gentle comfort. Other times it means setting boundaries or taking decisive action. This wisdom aspect makes compassion particularly effective for trauma healing, which requires discernment about when to comfort, when to challenge, and when to protect. The Buddhist approach to compassion also recognizes that genuine healing from trauma often involves transforming our relationship with pain rather than eliminating it entirely. Some traumatic impacts may continue to arise throughout life, but compassion practice helps us hold these experiences differently, with spaciousness, understanding, and care rather than fear or aversion. Practically, developing compassion for healing trauma involves both formal and informal practices. Formal practices include guided meditations that systematically cultivate compassion for ourselves and others. Informal practices involve bringing compassionate awareness to daily activities, especially when trauma responses are triggered. Over time, this compassionate presence becomes more natural and accessible, gradually transforming our relationship with traumatic memories and their aftermath. What makes the Buddhist approach to trauma healing through compassion unique is its integration of tenderness with clear seeing. It doesn't bypass the reality of harm or suggest we simply think positive. Instead, it teaches us to turn toward difficult truths about human experience while maintaining a heart that remains open rather than armored. This combination of clear seeing and open-heartedness creates the conditions where even deep traumatic wounds can gradually transform from sources of ongoing suffering to wellsprings of wisdom and connection. What makes the Buddhist approach to trauma healing through compassion unique is its integration of tenderness with clear seeing. It doesn't bypass the reality of harm or suggest we simply think positive. Instead, it teaches us to turn toward difficult truths about human experience while maintaining a heart that remains open rather than armored. This combination of clear seeing and open-heartedness creates the conditions where even deep traumatic wounds can gradually transform from sources of ongoing suffering to wellsprings of wisdom and connection. This balance of tenderness and clarity exemplifies one of the Buddha's most practical teachings for emotional healing, the middle way. When first teaching, the Buddha specifically described his approach as avoiding two extremes. Before his awakening, he had experienced both extremes personally, first living in luxury and sensual indulgence as a prince, then practicing extreme asceticism and self-denial as a wandering seeker. He discovered that neither extreme led to genuine happiness or freedom from suffering. The middle way, he discovered, isn't a compromise position halfway between opposites. It's more like finding the optimal tuning of a musical instrument, not too tight, not too loose. When applied to emotional healing specifically, the middle way offers a refreshingly balanced approach that avoids common pitfalls in how we handle difficult emotions. On one side is the extreme of emotional suppression or denial. This approach tries to control emotional pain by pushing it away, numbing it, or pretending it doesn't exist. Many people learn this strategy early in life, especially in families or cultures that discourage emotional expression. While suppression might seem to work in the short term by temporarily reducing discomfort, it creates long-term problems. Suppressed emotions don't actually disappear, they go underground, often emerging later in unexpected ways through physical symptoms, relationship difficulties, or sudden emotional eruptions. On the other side is the extreme of emotional indulgence or reactivity. This approach involves getting completely caught up in emotional states, acting them out impulsively, or building elaborate stories that intensify and prolong emotional reactions. Some therapeutic approaches inadvertently reinforce this extreme by suggesting that healing comes through fully expressing or cathartic emotions without the balanced awareness that prevents re-traumatization. The middle way offers an alternative that neither suppresses emotions nor becomes overwhelmed by them. It teaches us to acknowledge emotional wounds fully while maintaining enough awareness to avoid being completely identified with them. This balanced approach allows emotions to be felt and move through the body naturally, without either blocking their energy or being consumed by their intensity, practically speaking. Applying the middle way to emotional healing involves developing sensitivity to our particular tendencies. Most people lean habitually toward one extreme or the other, either stuffing emotions down or getting lost in emotional reactivity. Recognizing our default pattern is the first step toward finding greater balance. For those who tend toward suppression, the middle way involves gently turning toward emotions rather than away from them. This might mean setting aside regular time for emotional check-ins, learning to recognize physical sensations that signal emotional states, or working with a therapist who can provide safety for exploring previously avoided feelings. The key is approaching this exploration with patience and self-compassion rather than forcing confrontation with overwhelming emotions all at once. For those who tend toward emotional reactivity, the middle way involves developing greater containment and witnessing capacity. This doesn't mean suppressing emotions, but rather creating some space around them. Mindfulness practices help develop this capacity by strengthening the ability to observe thoughts and feelings without immediately acting on them. Over time, this creates more choice in how to respond to emotional triggers rather than being driven by automatic reactions. The beauty of the middle way approach is that it's dynamic rather than static. It's not about finding one perfect position and staying there, but about continuously adjusting in response to changing conditions. Sometimes emotional healing requires turning more directly toward painful feelings that have been avoided. Other times it requires stepping back from overwhelming emotion to regain perspective. The middle way teaches us to navigate this territory with flexibility rather than rigidity. This approach is particularly valuable for healing old emotional wounds that have created entrenched patterns. Many people oscillate between avoiding emotional pain and being flooded by it, never finding the balanced middle ground where actual healing can occur. The middle way provides practical guidance for finding this therapeutic window, the zone where we're engaged enough with emotions to process them, but not so overwhelmed that we become re-traumatized. Buddhist psychology offers specific practices for cultivating this middle path. Mindfulness meditation helps develop the capacity to stay present with difficult emotions without suppression or proliferation. Loving kindness and compassion practices create the emotional safety needed to face painful feelings without becoming overwhelmed by them. Wisdom practices help us see through the stories we create around emotional experiences that often intensify and prolong suffering. Neurologically, the middle way approach makes perfect sense. Research in interpersonal neurobiology identifies a window of tolerance, the optimal zone of arousal where emotional processing and integration can occur. When we're below this window, emotional suppression, the brain can't engage with emotional material to transform it. When we're above this window, emotional flooding, the brain's higher functions go offline, preventing integration. The middle way helps us stay within this productive window where real change can happen. What many practitioners discover is that the balanced approach of the middle way gradually expands their capacity to work with difficult emotions. Areas that once seemed overwhelming become workable. The rigid patterns of either avoidance or reactivity that kept emotional wounds in place begin to soften. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a process of consistent practice and gradual change, but the direction of transformation becomes clear as balance develops. The middle way also helps us navigate the complexities of emotional healing in relationships. Many emotional wounds occur in relationship contexts and continue to be triggered in current relationships. The balanced approach helps us neither withdraw completely from relational triggers nor become completely consumed by reactive patterns. We can stay engaged enough to work through difficult dynamics while maintaining enough awareness to avoid repeating harmful patterns. Perhaps most importantly, the middle way approach to emotional healing cultivates psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt our responses to fit changing circumstances rather than being locked into rigid patterns. This flexibility is the hallmark of emotional health. Rather than having one strategy for dealing with all emotional situations, we develop a range of responses that can be applied skillfully depending on the specific needs of each moment. This flexibility extends to how we think about emotional healing itself. The middle way avoids absolutist positions about what healing should look like or how it should unfold. Some wounds may transform completely, others may remain tender but become more workable. Still, others might continue to arise but within a broader context of acceptance and self-compassion. The balanced approach acknowledges this reality without either minimizing the possibility of profound healing or creating rigid expectations about what healing must look like. The Buddha's teaching on the middle way reminds us that emotional healing isn't about achieving some perfect state where difficult emotions never arise. It's about finding a balanced relationship with the full spectrum of human emotional experience, neither controlled by our emotions nor disconnected from them. This balanced relationship creates the conditions where even deep emotional wounds can gradually transform, not because we've eliminated all pain, but because we've changed how we relate to it. This balanced approach to our emotional experience connects naturally to another profound Buddhist teaching that has remarkable implications for emotional healing, the principle of anatta, or non-self. This teaching directly addresses one of the most challenging aspects of emotional wounds, the way they become intertwined with our sense of identity, creating the feeling that I am my wounds rather than I am experiencing the effects of wounding. The concept of non-self is often misunderstood as suggesting that we don't exist at all, which would be both incorrect and unhelpful. What the Buddha actually pointed to was that what we call self isn't a fixed, separate entity but rather a dynamic process made up of various components in constant interaction. He taught that when we look closely at what we consider to be our self, we find not a solid core but a collection of changing physical sensations, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and consciousness. This understanding has profound implications for emotional healing. Many emotional wounds persist precisely because they've become incorporated into our fundamental sense of who we are. The person who experienced childhood neglect doesn't just remember feeling unwanted, they come to believe I am unwanted as a core identity. The person who experienced betrayal doesn't just recall feeling violated, they develop an identity as the betrayed one. These wound-based identities then filter all new experiences, unconsciously seeking evidence that confirms these limited self-views. The teaching of non-self invites us to investigate these identities directly. Rather than taking them as solid truths about who we are, we can begin to notice how these self-concepts were constructed in response to painful experiences. We can observe how they're maintained through selective attention and habitual thought patterns. Most importantly, we can recognize that these limited identities aren't our essential nature but conditioned formations that can be transformed. This perspective doesn't minimize the very real impact of painful experiences or suggest we should simply think differently about deep wounds. Instead, it offers a way to stop perpetuating additional suffering by rigidly identifying with these wound-based self-concepts. It's the difference between acknowledging I experienced abuse and still feel its effects versus I am fundamentally and permanently damaged by abuse. Through meditation and mindfulness practices, we can begin to observe directly how these identities operate. We might notice, for example, how quickly certain situations trigger a familiar sense of being the worthless one or the rejected one. Rather than being completely identified with these perspectives, we can learn to recognize them as condition patterns arising in response to specific triggers. This witnessing capacity creates crucial space between our awareness and these limited identities. As this space develops, we start to recognize that there's something in us that can be aware of these wound-based identities without being defined by them. This awareness itself is more fundamental than any particular self-concept. It can hold the experience of emotional wounding within a larger context that isn't limited by that wounding. This doesn't erase the wounds or their effects, but changes our relationship to them fundamentally. The practical application of non-self-understanding to emotional healing involves regular inquiry into who we take ourselves to be, especially when emotional wounds are activated. When feelings of worthlessness arise, for example, we might ask, who is feeling worthless right now? What exactly is this self that seems so inadequate? Rather than accepting the feeling as an accurate reflection of reality or fighting against it, we investigate its nature directly. This inquiry often reveals that what seemed like a solid self-state is actually a complex mix of bodily sensations, emotional reactions, memories, and thought patterns all swirling together. None of these components alone constitutes a self, and none of them is permanent or unchanging. This direct seeing begins to loosen the grip of wound-based identities, not by rejecting them, but by recognizing their constructed nature. The understanding of non-self also helps us work with the stories we tell about our emotional wounds. Many of us carry narratives about how our wounds have defined our lives, how an early rejection determined all future relationships, for instance, or how a failure permanently limited our potential. These narratives seem to describe reality objectively, but they're actually interpretations that crystallize fluid experience into fixed identities and predictions. From the perspective of non-self, we can hold these narratives more lightly. We can recognize them as stories constructed by the mind rather than objective truths about who we are. This doesn't mean dismissing the very real impact of painful experiences, but it allows us to question whether these experiences must define our present and future in the ways we've assumed. What many practitioners discover through working with non-self-understanding is a profound sense of relief. The rigid identities that seemed so solid and limiting begin to feel more spacious and fluid. We start to recognize that we are neither defined by our wounds nor obligated to completely eliminate them. Instead, we can relate to them as changing aspects of experience arising within a much vaster field of awareness. Paradoxically, as identification with a wounded self diminishes, compassion often increases. When we're completely identified with our own pain, it can be hard to connect with others or see beyond our personal struggles, as we recognize that our self is not so solid or separate after all. We naturally feel more connected to others and more responsive to their suffering. The boundaries between my pain and others' pain become more permeable, fostering genuine compassion. This compassionate dimension of non-self-understanding is crucial for emotional healing. Many approaches to healing focus exclusively on fixing the individual self, sometimes inadvertently reinforcing the very sense of separate selfhood that contributes to suffering. The Buddhist approach integrates personal healing with a broader perspective that recognizes our interconnection with all life. This integration creates a healing that's both more complete and more sustainable. The practice of understanding non-self isn't about achieving some special state where the sense of self completely disappears. Rather, it's about relating to our sense of self more lightly and flexibly. We learn to hold our identities, including those shaped by emotional wounds, as useful conventions rather than ultimate truths. This lighter touch allows for greater flexibility, creativity, and responsiveness in how we navigate life's challenges. The practice of understanding non-self isn't about achieving some special state where the sense of self completely disappears. Rather, it's about relating to our sense of self more lightly and flexibly. We learn to hold our identities, including those shaped by emotional wounds, as useful conventions rather than ultimate truths. This lighter touch allows for greater flexibility, creativity, and responsiveness in how we navigate life's challenges. This more flexible relationship with our sense of self creates an excellent foundation for working with one of the most challenging emotional states that often keeps wounds active and painful: anger and resentment. These powerful emotions frequently arise in response to hurt, betrayal, injustice, or boundary violations. When not transformed skillfully, they can keep us locked in patterns of suffering long after the initial wounding events have passed. Buddhism offers a nuanced approach to working with anger that differs significantly from common misunderstandings. Many people assume that Buddhist practice means suppressing anger or pretending not to feel it, based on simplified interpretations of teachings about non-harming. In reality, the Buddha recognized anger as a natural human emotion that contains important information. What makes the Buddhist approach distinctive isn't the denial of anger, but the development of a wise relationship with it. This approach begins with honest recognition. Rather than judging ourselves for feeling angry or pretending we don't, we acknowledge anger's presence directly. This might sound simple, but it's actually quite challenging for many people who've been conditioned to believe that spiritual people shouldn't feel angry, or that anger is always destructive. The Buddha taught that trying to suppress or deny anger actually gives it more power over us. Only by acknowledging its presence can we begin to transform it. Once we recognize anger, Buddhist practice encourages us to observe it closely without immediate reaction. What does anger feel like in the body? Is there heat, tightness, pulsing energy? What thoughts accompany the anger? What stories are we telling ourselves about what happened and who's to blame? This careful observation creates a crucial space between the initial feeling of anger and our response to it. Without this space, we're likely to either act out the anger in ways that create more harm or turn it inward against ourselves. As we observe anger with mindfulness, we begin to recognize its composite nature. Anger isn't a solid, permanent entity, but a complex experience with physical, emotional, and cognitive components. This recognition alone begins to transform our relationship with anger. Rather than being completely identified with it, I am angry, we can see it as an experience moving through awareness. Anger is present right now. The Buddha taught that anger, like all emotions, arises dependent on conditions. When we explore these conditions, we often discover that anger emerges from unmet needs, perceived threats, or prior wounding that's been activated. This contextualization doesn't excuse harmful behavior, either our own or others, but it helps us understand anger's origins more clearly. This understanding naturally softens the rigid blame and judgment that often accompany anger and keep it burning. One of the most powerful aspects of the Buddhist approach to anger transformation is the recognition that holding on to resentment harms us first and foremost. The Buddha used the vivid metaphor of holding a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. We get burned first. This isn't meant to create guilt about feeling angry, but to motivate us to find skillful ways to work with it rather than letting it consume us. For emotional wounds, specifically, resentment often functions as a protective mechanism. If someone hurt us deeply, resentment can feel like a way to prevent future harm by keeping that person at a distance or maintaining vigilance against similar situations. While this protective function makes psychological sense, prolonged resentment often creates a prison of our own making. It keeps the wound active and painful while limiting our capacity for joy, trust, and connection. The Buddhist path offers specific practices for transforming anger and resentment related to old wounds. One approach involves mindful awareness of the stories we tell about what happened. Many of us replay narratives about past injuries repeatedly, each rehearsal reinforcing the anger and solidifying our identity as the wounded one. By observing these stories with mindfulness, we can begin to recognize them as constructions rather than objective reality. This doesn't mean what happened wasn't real or significant, but it helps us see how our current relationship with those events might be perpetuating suffering. Another powerful practice involves cultivating the opposite qualities to anger and resentment. The Buddha taught that hatred cannot be overcome by more hatred, only by its absence. This doesn't mean forcing ourselves to feel loving toward those who've harmed us, which often creates spiritual bypassing. Instead, it means gradually developing our capacity for qualities like equanimity, compassion, and goodwill, starting with easier relationships and situations before attempting to extend these qualities toward those who've wounded us deeply. For particularly deep wounds, the Buddhist approach acknowledges that transformation takes time and often requires appropriate support. The goal isn't to rush forgiveness or pretend we're not affected by significant harm. Rather, it's to gradually shift our relationship with anger from one where it controls us to one where we can hold it with awareness and respond skillfully rather than reactively. The process of transforming anger and resentment often involves grieving what was lost or what never was. Many emotional wounds involve legitimate losses of trust, safety, opportunity, connection, or dignity. Buddhism recognizes that before we can truly release resentment, we may need to fully acknowledge and mourn these losses. This grieving process, when approached with mindful awareness, gradually creates space for the heart to heal. What many practitioners discover is that transforming anger doesn't mean becoming passive or allowing harmful behavior to continue. In fact, the opposite often occurs. As reactive anger diminishes, a clearer, more grounded form of discernment emerges. This clarity allows us to set appropriate boundaries, take needed action, and protect ourselves and others without being driven by vengeful impulses or burning resentment. The Buddhist path recognizes that complete transformation of anger related to deep wounds is a process, not an event. There may be layers of anger that reveal themselves over time, especially when similar situations trigger old patterns. The practice involves meeting each new activation with fresh awareness rather than discouragement. Each time we work skillfully with anger rather than being consumed by it, we strengthen new neural pathways and emotional habits. Ultimately, the transformation of anger and resentment creates tremendous freedom. Energy that was bound up in maintaining old grudges and rehearsing past injuries becomes available for present engagement with life. The heart becomes more spacious, capable of experiencing a wider range of emotions without being overwhelmed. This doesn't mean we forget what happened or pretend it didn't matter. Rather, we hold the memory with a wisdom that understands how continuing to fuel resentment only extends our suffering. This freedom from the grip of anger and resentment naturally creates more space for another essential quality in Buddhist practice, equanimity, or upekkha. While often misunderstood as indifference or detachment, true equanimity is a balanced, steady presence that remains open to all experience without being overwhelmed by it. This quality becomes especially important when navigating the turbulent waters of emotional healing. Equanimity in Buddhism is considered one of the 4 divine abodes or Brahma-viharas, along with loving kindness, compassion, and appreciative joy. These qualities represent the heart's natural capacity when not clouded by greed, hatred, and delusion. Of these 4, equanimity is often described as the crowning achievement, the quality that brings balance and sustainability to the others. What makes equanimity so valuable for emotional healing is that it provides stability amid changing emotional states without suppressing or denying them. Unlike Stoicism, which might involve controlling or minimizing emotions, equanimity allows us to feel emotions fully while maintaining a grounded center that isn't completely identified with them. This creates the optimal conditions for processing difficult emotions without either becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. Equanimity develops through understanding several key insights from Buddhist psychology. First is the recognition that all experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, are constantly changing. When we truly internalize this truth, we stop grasping quite so desperately at pleasant states or pushing so hard against unpleasant ones. We begin to develop trust in the changing nature of experience itself, knowing that no emotional state, however intense, will last forever. Second, equanimity grows through understanding that we aren't in complete control of our experiences. While we can influence conditions, we can't dictate exactly how things will unfold or how we'll feel at every moment. This recognition helps us let go of the exhausting effort to micromanage our emotional states, allowing a more natural process of emotional healing to occur. Third, equanimity develops as we recognize that all beings experience the results of their actions according to natural laws, not our preferences. This understanding helps us navigate the complex emotions that arise around questions of justice, fairness, and accountability, especially regarding those who may have wounded us, without becoming cynical or resigned. We learn to work for justice while accepting that outcomes aren't entirely within our control. Practically speaking, cultivating equanimity for emotional healing involves several approaches. Formal meditation practices specifically focused on equanimity help develop this quality systematically. These typically involve reflecting on the changing nature of experience and consciously relaxing the tendency to grasp at what's pleasant or push away what's unpleasant. Over time, this creates a more spacious relationship with all experience. In daily life, we can practice equanimity by noticing when we're being pulled toward extremes, either getting caught up in emotional reactivity or shutting down to avoid feeling. The simple recognition, "this is how it is right now," can help us find middle ground, acknowledging reality without adding layers of judgment or resistance. This doesn't mean we don't take action to improve situations when possible, but we do so from a centered place rather than reactive urgency. For emotional wounds specifically, equanimity helps us stay present with painful memories or triggered states without becoming overwhelmed. When old wounds are activated, we often experience intense emotional reactions that feel like they might consume us completely. Equanimity provides the container that can hold these experiences without either suppressing them or being swept away. This containing function is essential for healing. It allows emotional material to be processed without re-traumatization. Equanimity also helps us relate more skillfully to the ups and downs of the healing process itself. Emotional healing rarely proceeds in a straight line. There are breakthroughs and setbacks, periods of clarity and periods of confusion. Without equanimity, we might become elated when healing seems to be progressing well, then despondent when old patterns resurface. Equanimity helps us take a longer view, recognizing that the overall trajectory matters more than day-to-day fluctuations. What many practitioners discover is that equanimity has a wisdom component that goes beyond emotional balance. As equanimity deepens, we develop greater discernment about when to engage actively with emotional material and when to let it be. We become more sensitive to what's needed in each moment, sometimes direct processing of wounds, sometimes allowing integration to happen more subtly, sometimes focusing on building resources before diving into difficult territory. This wisdom allows healing to unfold in its own time rather than according to our agendas. The equanimity that Buddhism cultivates isn't passive or disconnected. It's a deeply engaged presence that can respond appropriately to whatever arises. When emotional wounds are triggered, equanimity allows us to respond with what's needed, sometimes compassion, sometimes boundaries, sometimes simply spacious awareness, rather than through automatic reactions based on past conditioning. As equanimity develops, we find ourselves less at the mercy of emotional triggers related to old wounds. This doesn't mean we never get triggered, but our recovery time tends to shorten. We might notice, for instance, That a comment that once would have sent us into a day-long spiral of shame now creates momentary discomfort that passes relatively quickly. This resilience is a natural outcome of equanimity practice rather than something we have to force or fake. Perhaps most importantly, equanimity helps us navigate the tension between accepting our wounds and working to heal them. Without equanimity, we often oscillate between passive resignation, I guess I'll always be this way, and aggressive self-improvement projects. I need to fix myself completely. Equanimity allows us to acknowledge where we are right now while remaining open to growth and change. Without rigid expectations about what healing should look like or when it should happen. This balanced approach creates the conditions where profound healing becomes possible, not because we've forced it or achieved some perfect state, but because we've created an internal environment of acceptance, patience, and clear seeing that allows natural healing processes to unfold in their own time. This balanced approach creates the conditions where profound healing becomes possible, not because we've forced it or achieved some perfect state, but because we've created an internal environment of acceptance, patience, and clear seeing that allows natural healing processes to unfold in their own time. While qualities like mindfulness, compassion, and equanimity form the heart of Buddhist emotional healing practices, they don't exist in isolation. They're supported by something more fundamental: how we actually live our daily lives. This is where Buddhist ethics, or sila, becomes essential. Unlike many Western approaches to emotional healing that focus primarily on internal states or past processing, Buddhism recognizes that our everyday actions create the foundation upon which all other aspects of healing depend. Buddhist ethics isn't a system of commandments imposed from outside. It's more like a set of guidelines for living in harmony with reality and with others. The Buddha taught that acting ethically isn't about following rules to be good, but about aligning our actions with the way things actually work. Actions that harm ourselves or others inevitably create disturbance in the mind, while actions that come from compassion and wisdom naturally support emotional well-being. At the heart of Buddhist ethics are 5 basic training principles, often called precepts: avoiding killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, harmful speech, and intoxication that leads to heedlessness. These aren't framed as absolute commandments, but as training guidelines that help us observe the connection between our actions and their consequences for our own emotional state and for others. What makes this ethical foundation so important for emotional healing is that many of our emotional wounds get repeatedly aggravated by our own unskillful actions. Someone carrying wounds of betrayal might engage in preemptive betrayal of others, creating a cycle of mistrust and hurt. A person who experienced emotional neglect might use substances to numb the pain, inadvertently creating more isolation and disconnection. Living ethically helps break these cycles by aligning our behavior with our deepest values rather than with our reactive patterns. The Buddha emphasized that ethical living creates a foundation of safety and non-remorse that supports deeper emotional and spiritual work. When we know our actions aren't creating additional harm, we experience a kind of psychological safety that's crucial for healing. The mind isn't divided against itself, with one part wanting to heal while another part continues behaviors that create more wounding. Modern psychology confirms this connection between ethical behavior and emotional well-being. Research shows that alignment between our actions and our deeper values activates brain centers associated with positive emotion and resilience. Conversely, when we act in ways that contradict our own values, we experience internal conflict that makes us more vulnerable to stress, anxiety, and depression, all states that can reactivate and intensify old emotional wounds. For emotional healing specifically, ethical reflection helps us identify how our current behaviors might be perpetuating wounds from the past. Someone who experienced childhood manipulation might unconsciously engage in similar behaviors in their adult relationships, creating circumstances that continually remind them of their original wounds. By bringing mindful awareness to these patterns and committing to more ethical alternatives, they begin breaking the cycle. The Buddhist approach to ethics includes not only our actions toward others, but also how we treat ourselves. Many people with emotional wounds engage in subtle or overt forms of self-harm, negative self-talk, punishing behaviors, or placing themselves in situations that reactivate trauma. Buddhist ethical training includes cultivating greater kindness and respect toward ourselves, recognizing that self-directed harm is still harm and creates the same kinds of mental disturbance as harming others. The practice of ethical speech becomes particularly important for emotional healing. The Buddha placed special emphasis on how we use words, recognizing that speech can either perpetuate suffering or promote healing. Many emotional wounds get reinforced through habitual speech patterns, constantly retelling stories of victimization, engaging in harsh self-criticism, or using words to manipulate or control others out of our own insecurity. Buddhist speech ethics invites us to observe whether our words are true, helpful, kind, timely, and spoken with good intention. This doesn't mean never talking about difficult experiences. Honest communication about wounds can be essential for healing. But it encourages us to notice when our speech patterns keep wounds fresh rather than allowing them to heal. Are we speaking to process and transform our experience? Or are we using words to reinforce limited identities based on past hurts? Living ethically also creates the conditions for healthy relationships, which form another crucial component of emotional healing. Many wounds occur in relationship contexts and heal best within new, healthier relational experiences. When we commit to non-harming in our interactions, we create the safety that allows for authentic connection. These connections then provide essential support for our healing journey. What many practitioners discover is that ethical living isn't a restriction, but a profound form of self-care. By aligning our actions with principles that naturally support well-being, we create an inner and outer environment conducive to healing. This alignment reduces the internal conflict and external chaos that often keep emotional wounds activated and painful. The Buddhist approach to ethics also recognizes that perfect behavior isn't the point. We'll make mistakes, act from old patterns, and sometimes cause harm despite our best intentions. What matters is our willingness to acknowledge these mistakes, make amends when possible, and reconnect with our ethical intentions. This process of recognition and recommitment itself becomes part of the healing journey rather than a detour from it. The connection between ethics and emotional healing operates in both directions. As we heal emotionally, ethical behavior often becomes more natural. Many harmful actions stem from unprocessed pain, fear, or misunderstanding. As we work through emotional wounds, we find ourselves less driven by the reactive patterns that led to harmful behavior in the first place. We develop greater capacity to respond to life's challenges from wisdom and compassion rather than from old wounds. This ethical foundation for emotional well-being doesn't exist in isolation. The Buddha recognized that spiritual practice, including emotional healing, flourishes best within a supportive community. This is why he established the Sangha, or spiritual community, as one of the 3 fundamental refuges for practitioners. Along with the Buddha, awakened awareness, and the Dharma, teachings and truth, the Sangha provides essential relational support for the challenging work of emotional healing. While some aspects of healing require individual introspection and practice, many emotional wounds originated in relationship contexts and heal most completely through new relational experiences. The Sangha creates a container where these healing relationships can develop. In traditional Buddhist contexts, the Sangha referred primarily to the community of monastics who had dedicated their lives to practice. In contemporary settings, especially for lay practitioners, Sangha has come to mean any community of practitioners supporting each other on the path. This might include formal meditation groups, retreat communities, or even virtual connections with fellow practitioners. What makes a healthy Sangha so valuable for emotional healing is that it provides something many of us never experienced in our families or origin or social groups: a community dedicated to presence, truth, and compassion. Within this environment, aspects of ourselves that were rejected or misunderstood in other contexts can be witnessed with acceptance and care. This witnessing itself is powerfully healing. A supportive Sangha also provides essential feedback and reflection that's difficult to access alone. Our emotional wounds often create blind spots, areas where we can't see our own patterns clearly because they feel normal or inevitable to us. Compassionate reflection from others who share our values and understand our path can help illuminate these blind spots without the shame or judgment that might come from those who don't understand the healing journey. The Buddha emphasized the importance of good spiritual friends, Kalyanamitta, on the path, recognizing that who we spend time with profoundly influences our development. For emotional healing specifically, spending time with others committed to mindfulness, compassion, and ethical living helps counterbalance the tendency to fall back into old patterns. When we see others responding to challenges with greater awareness and care, it expands our sense of what's possible for ourselves. Modern neuroscience confirms the biological importance of supportive community for emotional healing. Research in interpersonal neurobiology shows that our nervous systems literally regulate each other. When we spend time with people whose nervous systems are balanced and regulated, it helps our own system find greater stability. This co-regulation creates the neurological safety needed to process difficult emotional material without becoming overwhelmed. For those with significant attachment wounds or developmental trauma, the relational aspect of healing becomes particularly important. Many early wounds occurred pre-verbally in attachment relationships, creating implicit patterns that can't be reached through insight or individual practice alone. These patterns often need new experiences of attunement, care, and secure connection to reorganize. A healthy Sangha can provide opportunities for these reparative experiences. The value of Sangha extends beyond direct interpersonal support to include the power of collective practice. When we meditate, reflect, or study together with others, there's an amplifying effect. Many practitioners report being able to go deeper in their practice when supported by the energy of a group than they can alone. For emotional healing, this collective field can help us access and process difficult material that might feel too overwhelming to approach individually. What distinguishes a true Sangha from other types of communities is its orientation toward awakening rather than just mutual support or belonging. While therapeutic groups or general social connections have value, a spiritual community dedicated to truth, awakening, and liberation creates a unique container for transformation. The shared commitment to seeing clearly, even when it's uncomfortable, provides the foundation for genuine healing rather than just comfort or validation. The Sangha also reminds us that our individual suffering and healing exist within a broader collective context. Many emotional wounds that seem purely personal actually reflect cultural patterns, social conditions, or intergenerational trauma. The community perspective helps us recognize these broader dimensions without diminishing our individual experience. This recognition can be liberating, helping us see that our wounds aren't just personal failings, but part of larger human patterns that can be understood and transformed. In practical terms, engaging with Sangha for emotional healing might take many forms. It could involve regular meditation with a local group, attending retreats, working with a teacher or mentor in the tradition, or participating in study groups focused on applying Buddhist principles to personal transformation. The key is finding connections with others who share a commitment to waking up and are willing to engage in authentic, compassionate relationship. For those who've been hurt in religious or spiritual communities in the past, approaching Sangha might understandably bring up concerns about authority, power dynamics, or group pressure. Healthy Buddhist communities recognize these concerns and strive to create structures that minimize potential harm while maximizing genuine support. This includes clear ethical guidelines for teachers, transparent decision-making processes, and respect for personal boundaries and individual paths. What many practitioners discover is that the journey of emotional healing, while deeply personal, doesn't have to be, and perhaps cannot be, walked entirely alone. The support of others who understand both the challenges and the possibilities of this path provides encouragement during difficult periods and celebration during breakthroughs. The Sangha reminds us that even in our most isolated feeling moments, we're part of a stream of practitioners stretching back thousands of years who have worked with their own wounds and found paths to greater freedom and well-being. Through the support of community, the principles and practices of Buddhism become living realities rather than merely intellectual concepts. We see how mindfulness, compassion, ethical living, and wisdom actually manifest in human lives and relationships. These embodied examples inspire our own practice and help us recognize possibilities we might not have imagined for our own healing journey. Through the support of community, the principles and practices of Buddhism become living realities rather than merely intellectual concepts. We see how mindfulness, compassion, ethical living, and wisdom actually manifest in human lives and relationships. These embodied examples inspire our own practice and help us recognize possibilities we might not have imagined for our own healing journey. While the support of community provides essential context for healing, the inner work of transforming emotional wounds often requires more specific meditative techniques. This is where Vipassana meditation offers powerful tools for seeing our emotional landscape with unprecedented clarity. Vipassana, which means clear seeing or insight, is one of the Buddha's most transformative teachings for emotional healing because it helps us perceive emotions as they actually are, without the distortions of habitual perception. Vipassana differs from many other forms of meditation in its primary goal. While some meditation practices aim to create particular states of mind, like calmness or concentration, Vipassana focuses on developing clear perception of whatever is already happening in our experience. This quality of precise observation becomes especially valuable when working with difficult emotions connected to old wounds. The basic technique involves directing careful, moment-by-moment attention to our experience as it unfolds, rather than getting caught in stories about emotions or trying to change them. We simply observe them with interest and precision. What exactly does anger feel like in the body? Where is the sensation of sadness located? How does anxiety manifest as energy? This direct observation bypasses our conceptual understanding of emotions and brings us into direct contact with their living reality. Through Vipassana practice, we begin noticing that what we call an emotion is actually a complex process with multiple components. There are physical sensations in the body, mental images and thoughts, energetic qualities, and often stories or meanings we attribute to the experience. By observing these components separately, emotions that once seemed solid and overwhelming begin to reveal themselves as fluid, changing processes. This detailed observation naturally reveals what the Buddha called the three characteristics of existence: impermanence, anicca, unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. We directly observe how emotions constantly change, how clinging to or resisting them creates suffering, and how they lack an independent, solid existence. These insights aren't abstract philosophy, but direct observations that transform our relationship with emotional pain. For example, someone practicing Vipassana might notice that grief, which had felt like a permanent condition defining their whole being, actually fluctuates dramatically throughout a single meditation session. They might observe moments of intense chest tightness and tears alternating with periods of relative calm, or notice how certain thoughts intensify the grief while moments of simple presence allow it to move and change. This direct perception of impermanence doesn't diminish the importance of the loss, but helps prevent being completely identified with grief as a fixed state. The precision developed in Vipassana helps us recognize patterns in our emotional lives that were previously invisible to us. Many emotional reactions happen so quickly and automatically that we don't notice the sequence of perceptions, feelings, and thoughts that trigger them. Through careful observation, we start seeing these sequences clearly. How a particular sensation triggers a memory, which prompts a thought, which generates an emotion, which reinforces a belief about ourselves. This clarity about patterns gives us more choice in how to respond. One of the most valuable aspects of Vipassana for emotional healing is how it helps us distinguish between primary emotions and the secondary reactions that often amplify and prolong suffering. Primary emotions like sadness, fear, or anger arise directly in response to situations. Secondary reactions are how we respond to having those emotions, often with judgment, resistance, stories, or additional emotions about the primary ones. Vipassana helps us see this layering process clearly and respond more skillfully to the initial emotion without the added layers of reactivity. For many practitioners, one of the most liberating insights from Vipassana practice is the recognition that they are not their emotions. Rather than being completely identified with emotional states, they discover the capacity to witness emotions from a more spacious awareness. This witnessing perspective doesn't deny or disconnect from emotions, but holds them in a larger context. The person who once felt, "I am my anxiety," begins to recognize, "I am experiencing anxiety" within a wider field of awareness. The development of this witnessing capacity is gradual and happens through consistent practice rather than force of will. Traditionally, practitioners begin with shorter periods of meditation and work up to longer durations as their capacity strengthens. Even short daily practices of 15 or 20 minutes can begin developing the neural pathways that support this witnessing awareness. Over time, this capacity extends beyond formal meditation into daily life situations where emotional triggers arise. For emotional wounds specifically, Vipassana offers a way to process emotions that have remained stuck or frozen in the body and psyche. Many trauma therapists now recognize that emotions connected to difficult experiences need to be processed physically and energetically, not just understood intellectually. Vipassana provides a way to safely access and process these stuck emotions by approaching them with precise awareness rather than being overwhelmed by them. The approach typically involves establishing enough stability and grounding first, often through practices focused on the breath or body as a whole. From this foundation of stability, the practitioner can then turn attention toward more difficult emotional material in manageable doses, rather than diving straight into the most intense aspects of traumatic memories. Vipassana teaches us to work at the edges of difficult material, gradually building capacity to stay present with stronger emotions. What makes Vipassana particularly effective for emotional healing is that it works directly with present moment experience rather than getting caught in stories about the past or future. While understanding the origins and context of our wounds has value, true healing happens in the present, in how we experience emotions right now. Vipassana brings us into direct contact with this living reality rather than conceptual understanding about it. The clarity developed through Vipassana naturally influences how we relate to emotions in daily life. We become less likely to suppress difficult emotions or act them out unconsciously. Instead, we develop the capacity to feel emotions fully while maintaining enough awareness to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. This combination of full feeling and clear seeing creates the optimal conditions for emotional wounds to process and heal naturally. Many practitioners find that Vipassana helps them move through emotional experiences more completely, rather than emotions getting stuck or lingering for days. The clear seeing allows emotions to process through their natural cycle and complete. This doesn't mean emotions disappear instantly, but they move through us more fluidly rather than getting blocked or becoming chronic states that define our identity. While Vipassana meditation can be learned from books or audio guides, traditionally it's best learned with the guidance of experienced teachers who can help navigate the challenges that inevitably arise. These challenges often include encounters with difficult emotions or memories that have been avoided. A skilled teacher can provide essential guidance on how to work with such material safely, not pushing too fast into overwhelming territory, but also not avoiding the emotional work necessary for genuine healing. The insights gained through Vipassana meditation don't just help us work more effectively with everyday emotional fluctuations. They also give us tools for facing some of life's most challenging experiences, particularly grief and loss. The Buddha placed special emphasis on understanding how to work with grief, recognizing it as one of the most universal and potentially transformative human experiences when approached with wisdom and compassion. The Buddhist approach to grief differs significantly from many modern Western attitudes, which often treat grief as something to get over quickly or push through. Instead, Buddhism recognizes grief as a natural, important response to loss that deserves to be fully honored and experienced. At the same time, Buddhist teachings offer perspectives and practices that help prevent grief from becoming a permanent state of being that defines our identity or limits our capacity for joy and connection. This balanced approach begins with complete acknowledgement of loss and its impact. The Buddha never suggested we should suppress grief or pretend not to feel it in the name of spiritual detachment. In fact, there are many stories in the Buddhist tradition of practitioners, including the Buddha himself, experiencing profound grief at the loss of loved ones. What Buddhism offers isn't a way around grief, but a way through it that allows its transformative potential to unfold. One of the most helpful Buddhist perspectives on loss comes from the teaching on impermanence. While this teaching is sometimes misunderstood as minimizing the importance of relationships or suggesting we shouldn't care deeply about others, it actually offers a profound context for understanding loss. Everything in life exists in a constant state of change, including all relationships and beings we love. This truth doesn't make loss less painful when it occurs, but it helps us recognize loss as part of the natural order rather than something that has gone terribly wrong or happened only to us. Understanding impermanence also helps us recognize that our relationship with what we've lost continues to change after the physical loss. The first raw stages of grief gradually transform into different ways of relating to the memory and continuing impact of what was lost. Buddhism encourages us to notice this evolution rather than expecting grief to remain static or to completely disappear. Just as our relationship with a loved one evolved during their life, our relationship with their memory and impact continues to change after their death. The mindfulness practices central to Buddhism provide practical tools for working with grief directly. Rather than either avoiding grief feelings or becoming completely overwhelmed by them, mindfulness helps us create enough space to feel grief fully while maintaining a witnessing awareness. This balance allows grief to process naturally through its cycles rather than becoming stuck or overwhelming our capacity to function. Compassion practices offer another essential dimension of Buddhist grief work. Many people experience difficult secondary emotions around grief: guilt about not grieving correctly, shame about being vulnerable, or judgment about how long grief is lasting. Compassion practice helps us meet all of these responses with kindness rather than criticism, creating a supportive internal environment for grief to unfold in its own way and time. The Buddhist understanding of interconnection also provides comfort and perspective during grief. While we experience the physical separation from what was lost, Buddhism reminds us that the impact and influence of every relationship continue in countless seen and unseen ways. Every person we've loved has changed us, and those changes ripple outward through all our subsequent interactions. This ongoing influence doesn't replace the physical presence we miss, but it offers a broader perspective on the continuing nature of connection beyond physical proximity. Many Buddhist traditions have developed specific rituals and practices for honoring loss and supporting those who are grieving. These might include meditation ceremonies, recitation of texts, offerings, or communal gatherings that acknowledge the reality of loss while placing it in a spiritual context. Unlike some religious approaches that focus primarily on the afterlife status of the deceased, Buddhist rituals tend to honor the full range of human emotions while also cultivating qualities that support healing, awareness, compassion, and wisdom. What many find most valuable in the Buddhist approach to grief is that it makes space for profound sadness while avoiding the extremes that can make grief more difficult, either denying the reality of loss through spiritual bypassing or becoming completely identified with grief as a permanent condition. Buddhism recognizes that fully experienced grief can actually open the heart to greater compassion and appreciation for the preciousness of life. This transformative potential of grief is something many Buddhist practitioners discover through their own experience. When we allow ourselves to feel the full impact of loss without shutting down or being completely overwhelmed, grief often gradually transforms into a deeper capacity to connect with all of life. The broken open heart becomes more sensitive not only to suffering, but also to joy, beauty, and the preciousness of each moment and relationship. The Buddhist approach recognizes that significant losses permanently change us. We don't get over them or return to exactly who we were before. Instead, we learn to integrate the loss into a new understanding of ourselves and life. This integration doesn't happen through intellectual acceptance alone, but through the lived experience of moving through grief with awareness, allowing it to transform us without defining us completely. The Buddhist approach recognizes that significant losses permanently change us. We don't get over them or return to exactly who we were before. Instead, we learn to integrate the loss into a new understanding of ourselves and life. This integration doesn't happen through intellectual acceptance alone, but through the lived experience of moving through grief with awareness, allowing it to transform us without defining us completely. While Buddhist teachings offer specific practices for working with particular emotional challenges like grief, they also provide a comprehensive framework for transforming suffering in all its forms. This complete approach is outlined in the Noble Eightfold Path, which addresses every dimension of human life, from our understanding and intentions to our actions, speech, livelihood, effort, awareness, and mental development. What makes this path so powerful for emotional healing is precisely its comprehensiveness. Rather than treating emotional wounds in isolation, it recognizes how all aspects of our lives contribute to either suffering or well-being. The Eightfold Path begins with right view or understanding, which forms the foundation for all other aspects of the path. In terms of emotional healing, right view involves recognizing the reality of suffering without minimizing it, understanding its causes, and developing confidence that liberation from suffering is possible. This perspective differs significantly from approaches that either deny emotional pain or view it as permanent and defining. Right view helps us see our emotional wounds accurately, acknowledging their reality and impact, while also recognizing their potential for transformation. For someone working with deep emotional wounds, developing right view might involve honestly acknowledging how past experiences have shaped their emotional patterns, while simultaneously recognizing that these patterns aren't fixed or permanent. It means seeing clearly how certain habitual reactions perpetuate suffering without judging oneself for having these reactions. This clear seeing creates the foundation for all other aspects of healing work. Right intention follows from right view and addresses the motivations and commitments that drive our healing process. For emotional healing specifically, right intention involves developing genuine commitment to freedom from harmful patterns while approaching this journey with kindness rather than harsh self-improvement agendas. Many people initially approach emotional healing with mixed motivations, perhaps wanting relief from pain, but also fearful of what they might discover or what might be required of them. Right intention helps clarify and purify these motivations, aligning them with our deepest values. The next three aspects of the path, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, address how we express ourselves in the world. These ethical dimensions might seem separate from emotional healing, but they're actually essential to it. Our words, actions, and how we earn our living powerfully impact our emotional state and either reinforce old wounds or support healing. For instance, someone healing from trust issues might notice how certain speech patterns like chronic complaining, gossip, or passive-aggressive comments keep their suspicion and cynicism active. Practicing right speech by committing to honest, kind, and helpful communication creates new patterns that support healing rather than undermining it. Similarly, right action involves making behavioral choices that align with healing intentions rather than continuing actions that reactivate or deepen old wounds. Right livelihood extends this ethical dimension to how we engage with work and economic activity. Many people don't consider how their work environment or the nature of their work impacts emotional healing. Yet, spending most of our waking hours in toxic work cultures or in occupations that conflict with our deeper values inevitably affects our emotional well-being. The Eightfold Path includes livelihood precisely because it recognizes that genuine healing must address this significant portion of our lives. The next aspect, right effort, addresses how we engage with the healing process itself. This involves developing a balanced approach to emotional work, neither pushing ourselves too harshly nor avoiding difficult material. Right effort teaches us to recognize when to actively work with emotional patterns and when to step back and allow natural healing processes to unfold. This balanced effort prevents the extremes of either aggressive self-improvement projects or passive resignation to suffering. Right mindfulness, which we've explored in earlier discussions of meditation practices, involves developing present moment awareness of our experience without judgment. For emotional healing specifically, mindfulness helps us stay present with difficult emotions without either suppressing them or becoming overwhelmed by them. This quality of awareness creates the optimal conditions for processing and integrating emotional wounds rather than perpetuating them through avoidance or rumination. The final aspect, right concentration or samadhi, involves developing a stable, collected, and focused mind. While often associated with formal meditation practices, concentration also manifests as the capacity to stay engaged with emotional healing processes without becoming scattered, distracted, or lost in tangential concerns. This mental stability provides the foundation for sustained emotional work, allowing us to stay with difficult material long enough for genuine transformation to occur. What makes the Eightfold Path so effective for emotional healing is that it works simultaneously on multiple levels. Unlike approaches that focus exclusively on changing thoughts, processing past experiences, or modifying behaviors, the Eightfold Path addresses all these dimensions in an integrated way. It recognizes that sustainable emotional healing requires alignment across our understanding, intentions, behaviors, speech, work, effort, awareness, and mental focus. The path isn't linear but cyclical and mutually reinforcing. As our understanding deepens, our intentions clarify. As our actions become more aligned with our values, our mind becomes more stable. As mindfulness increases, our understanding becomes more nuanced. This interconnected nature creates a positive spiral where improvement in one area supports growth in all others. For those working with specific emotional wounds, the comprehensiveness of the Eightfold Path helps address both obvious and subtle aspects of healing. Consider someone healing from childhood emotional neglect. Right understanding helps them recognize the reality of what was missing in their development without self-pity or blame. Right intention cultivates genuine commitment to healing while maintaining compassion for themselves and their caregivers. Right speech and action involve learning to express needs and set boundaries that weren't modeled in childhood. Right livelihood might mean seeking work environments that provide appropriate recognition and support. Right effort balances active healing work with patience for developmental processes that unfold gradually. Right mindfulness creates space to feel the pain of what was missing while staying grounded in present reality. Right concentration develops the mental stability to stay with uncomfortable emotions long enough for new patterns to form. This comprehensive approach recognizes that emotional wounds don't exist in isolation but within the complex ecosystem of our entire lives. By addressing all dimensions simultaneously, the Eightfold Path creates conditions where healing becomes not just a specific project, but a natural outcome of how we're living. The changes aren't superficial or temporary, but represent a fundamental shift in our relationship with ourselves, others, and life itself. While the Noble Eightfold Path provides a comprehensive framework for transforming suffering, there are specific emotional challenges that require particular attention in the healing journey. One of the most difficult yet potentially liberating aspects of emotional healing involves the practice of forgiveness. Buddhist traditions offer unique perspectives on forgiveness that differ in important ways from how it's often understood in Western contexts. In Buddhist practice, forgiveness isn't primarily about the other person or what they did. It's about freeing our own heart from the burden of resentment, hatred, and endless rehearsing of past injuries. This distinction is crucial because it shifts forgiveness from something that depends on others' actions or remorse to a practice we can engage in regardless of external circumstances. This doesn't mean condoning harmful actions or denying their impact. Rather, it recognizes that holding on to resentment creates ongoing suffering primarily for ourselves. The Buddha used vivid imagery to illustrate this point, comparing holding on to anger to grasping a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. We get burned first. This isn't meant to create guilt about feeling angry, but to motivate us to find freedom from anger's consuming fire. Forgiveness practice offers a systematic approach to finding this freedom through gradually releasing layers of resentment and hurt that keep us bound to painful past experiences. Buddhist forgiveness practice often begins with forgiveness toward ourselves. Many of us carry deep self-blame, shame, or regret about past actions or perceived failures. These self-directed negative emotions create a harsh internal environment that makes healing from any wound more difficult. By starting with self-forgiveness, we create a foundation of kindness and compassion that supports the entire forgiveness process. Self-forgiveness isn't about excusing harmful actions we may have committed or pretending mistakes don't matter. Instead, it involves recognizing our fundamental humanity, including our capacity for error and unskillfulness, especially when we ourselves were suffering or unaware. It means extending to ourselves the same understanding and compassion we might offer a dear friend who made mistakes while doing their best with the awareness and resources they had at the time. The practice typically involves reflection on specific actions or patterns we regret, acknowledging the harm caused without minimization, connecting with sincere remorse, which differs from toxic shame, and extending forgiveness to ourselves as beings who are learning and growing. This process isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing practice that gradually softens the heart's harsh judgment against itself. Once we've established some foundation in self-forgiveness, Buddhist practice often extends to forgiving others for smaller hurts before addressing deeper wounds. This gradual approach builds our capacity for forgiveness rather than attempting to force forgiveness for major betrayals or violations before we're ready. Just as we wouldn't try to lift a heavy weight without proper training, wisdom recognizes that forgiveness for deep wounds often requires developing emotional strength through practice with lighter burdens first. Buddhist forgiveness doesn't operate on a timetable or follow prescribed stages. It recognizes that genuine forgiveness unfolds according to its own organic process as conditions for healing develop. Trying to force forgiveness before we're ready often creates spiritual bypassing, a superficial forgiveness that covers over genuine hurt rather than transforming it. True forgiveness emerges naturally as we develop greater understanding, compassion, and emotional capacity through consistent practice. For particularly deep wounds, Buddhist practice acknowledges that forgiveness may unfold in layers over long periods, sometimes even years or decades. Each layer of forgiveness that releases brings greater freedom, even if complete forgiveness hasn't yet occurred. This patient, gradual approach prevents the discouragement that can arise when we expect instant transformation of deeply entrenched emotional patterns. The practice of forgiveness in Buddhist traditions is supported by specific meditation techniques that help transform the heart's relationship to painful memories and those who caused harm. Metta, loving-kindness practice, gradually extends goodwill toward increasingly difficult people, softening the boundaries of the heart that keep resentment in place. Karuna, compassion, practice develops understanding of the suffering and ignorance that often drive harmful behavior, without excusing its impact. Mudita, appreciative joy, helps counteract the tendency to define others entirely by their harmful actions by recognizing their humanity beyond those actions. One of the most powerful aspects of Buddhist forgiveness practice is its recognition that forgiveness and appropriate boundaries can coexist. Many people resist forgiveness because they mistakenly believe it means allowing harmful behavior to continue or resuming relationships that aren't healthy. Buddhist teachings distinguish between forgiveness as an internal state of heart and the external decisions we make about engagement with those who have harmed us. We can forgive someone internally, releasing our own resentment and hatred, while still maintaining whatever boundaries are necessary for safety and well-being. This nuanced understanding helps resolve the common dilemma where people feel they must choose between self-protection and forgiveness. The Buddhist approach suggests we can do both, maintain appropriate caution and boundaries while also working to free our hearts from the prison of resentment and hatred. This integration allows forgiveness to become a practice of freedom rather than a potential source of further harm. Buddhist forgiveness practice also recognizes the social and systemic dimensions of harm. Some injuries occur within broader contexts of oppression, injustice, or power imbalance. Addressing these wounds may require not only personal forgiveness work, but also engagement with social change and justice. Again, these aren't opposing paths but complementary dimensions of healing. We work to free our hearts from consuming hatred while also taking whatever actions are appropriate to prevent further harm and create more just conditions. What many practitioners discover through consistent forgiveness practice is that the heart has a remarkable capacity for healing when given proper support and conditions. Resentments that once seemed permanent gradually lose their grip. Memories that were once unbearably painful can eventually be held with equanimity and compassion. This transformation doesn't happen through force of will or intellectual decision, but through the patient cultivation of understanding, compassion, and letting go that Buddhist practice develops over time. What many practitioners discover through consistent forgiveness practice is that the heart has a remarkable capacity for healing when given proper support and conditions. Resentments that once seemed permanent gradually lose their grip. Memories that were once unbearably painful can eventually be held with equanimity and compassion. This transformation doesn't happen through force of will or intellectual decision, but through the patient cultivation of understanding, compassion, and letting go that Buddhist practice develops over time. This healing process can be significantly enhanced when we draw upon both the ancient wisdom of Buddhist practice and the insights of modern psychological approaches. Over the past few decades, a fascinating dialogue has emerged between Buddhist traditions and Western psychology, creating integrated approaches to emotional healing that honor both lineages. This integration offers something neither tradition can provide alone, combining Buddhism's sophisticated methods for working with the mind and heart with psychology's nuanced understanding of human development, trauma, and relational patterns. Western psychology brings valuable frameworks for understanding how emotional wounds form in specific developmental contexts. It helps us recognize how early attachment patterns shape our adult relationships, how trauma impacts the nervous system, and how family dynamics create recurring emotional patterns. These insights provide crucial context for understanding our particular wounds and why certain emotions feel so overwhelming or persistent. For instance, attachment theory from psychology helps explain why someone who experienced inconsistent caregiving in childhood might struggle with anxious attachment in adult relationships. constantly fearing abandonment. This understanding helps normalize these fears rather than seeing them as personal failings. At the same time, Buddhist practices offer concrete methods for working with the anxiety these attachment patterns generate, developing mindful awareness of anxious sensations, extending compassion toward the wounded parts of self, and recognizing the impermanent nature of all emotional states. Buddhist practices also offer tools for working directly with the body and nervous system, areas increasingly recognized as crucial in psychological healing. Many emotional wounds aren't stored primarily in conceptual understanding, but in bodily sensations, nervous system patterns, and implicit memories. Mindfulness meditation provides a way to access and work with these bodily dimensions of emotional experience, gradually releasing patterns of tension and activation that maintain old wounds. The dialogue between these traditions has created several therapeutic approaches that explicitly integrate psychological understanding with contemplative practice. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy combines mindfulness practices with cognitive approaches to prevent depression relapse. Dialectical behavior therapy incorporates mindfulness skills to help regulate intense emotions. Acceptance and commitment therapy draws on Buddhist-inspired acceptance practices while helping people clarify and live by their values. These integrative approaches have shown remarkable effectiveness for various emotional challenges. What makes this integration particularly powerful is how these traditions can address different aspects of healing. Psychology often excels at understanding the why behind our emotional patterns, why we react as we do based on past experiences and learning. Buddhism offers powerful methods for working with the how to be with difficult emotions, how to relate differently to thoughts, how to cultivate positive qualities that counterbalance negative tendencies. Together, they provide both insight into origins and practical methods for transformation. The integration also helps address common pitfalls in each approach when practiced in isolation. Some psychological approaches can inadvertently strengthen identification with wounds or diagnoses, creating static identities around traumatic experiences or mental health labels. Buddhist perspectives on non-self and impermanence provide a helpful corrective, reminding us that even long-standing patterns aren't our essential identity but conditioned processes that can change. Conversely, some Buddhist communities might sometimes bypass the importance of psychological understanding or healing developmental wounds, emphasizing transcendence without adequate attention to necessary psychological work. Psychological insights help ensure that spiritual practice doesn't become another form of avoidance or bypassing of necessary emotional processing. Neuroscience research has become an interesting meeting ground for these traditions, validating many Buddhist insights about the mind while explaining them in the language of brain science. Studies show that regular meditation practice actually changes brain structure and function in areas related to attention, emotion regulation, and empathy. This research helps bridge the conceptual gap between ancient contemplative insights and modern scientific understanding, making Buddhist approaches more accessible to those who might be skeptical of their religious or cultural packaging. One particularly helpful aspect of this integration is how it addresses different timescales of healing. Some emotional relief can come relatively quickly through psychological interventions or certain meditation techniques. Other aspects of healing unfold over much longer timeframes as neural networks rewire and deep patterns gradually shift through consistent practice. Understanding both immediate and long-term aspects of healing helps create realistic expectations and sustainable practice. The integration also acknowledges the importance of both individual and relational healing. While meditation can create powerful internal shifts, many emotional wounds occurred in relationship contexts and require new relational experiences to fully heal. Psychological approaches often excel at understanding and working with relationship patterns, while Buddhist perspectives offer practices for bringing greater awareness, compassion, and wisdom to these relationships. Together, they create a more complete approach that addresses both internal patterns and external relationships. Many practitioners find that this integration helps them navigate the sometimes challenging territory between acceptance and change. Some approaches emphasize accepting ourselves exactly as we are, while others focus on transforming unhelpful patterns. The integrated perspective recognizes that genuine acceptance paradoxically creates the conditions where change becomes possible. We don't have to choose between accepting our wounds and healing them. The former actually facilitates the latter. What makes this integration particularly relevant today is that many people are seeking approaches to emotional healing that honor the psychological realities of trauma and development, while also addressing deeper existential and spiritual dimensions of human experience. The dialogue between Buddhism and psychology creates space for this comprehensive approach, one that can address the full complexity of human suffering and potential without reducing either to simplistic explanations. This integration isn't about creating a perfect synthesis or diluting either tradition. Rather, it's about skillfully drawing from both wisdom streams to address the particular needs of each person and situation. Someone healing from complex trauma might need substantial psychological support before certain meditation practices become helpful. Someone struggling with existential questions might benefit more from Buddhist perspectives on impermanence and non-self. The integration allows for this personalized approach rather than applying one-size-fits-all solutions. For many practitioners, the most valuable aspect of this integration is simply its pragmatism. It's about finding what actually helps reduce suffering and increase well-being, regardless of theoretical origin. This practical focus on what works mirrors the Buddha's own pragmatic approach. He consistently emphasized that his teachings should be tested through direct experience rather than accepted on authority or tradition. This experimental attitude creates space for ongoing dialogue and refinement as we continue learning about effective approaches to emotional healing. The ongoing conversation between these traditions continues to evolve as practitioners and researchers explore how ancient wisdom and modern understanding can complement each other. What remains constant is the shared commitment to alleviating suffering and supporting human flourishing, a goal that transcends cultural and historical boundaries while remaining deeply relevant to our contemporary emotional challenges. This practical focus on alleviating suffering connects naturally to another powerful Buddhist practice that directly addresses a common source of emotional pain: the tendency to compare ourselves with others and feel diminished by their success or happiness. This practice is mudita, often translated as sympathetic or altruistic joy, the ability to take genuine delight in the happiness and good fortune of others. Mudita is one of the 4 divine abodes or Brahmaviharas in Buddhist practice, along with loving kindness, compassion, and equanimity. While loving kindness wishes happiness for all beings and compassion responds to suffering, mudita specifically celebrates the happiness, success, and good fortune that others already experience. It directly counteracts the painful emotions of envy, resentment, and inadequacy that arise when we see others thriving. Many emotional wounds involve some form of comparative suffering, feeling that we're somehow less worthy, fortunate, or lovable than others. Social media often intensifies these feelings as we scroll through carefully curated highlights of others' lives. The practice of mudita offers a revolutionary alternative to this painful comparison. Instead of seeing others' happiness as somehow diminishing our own, we learn to celebrate it, recognizing that joy is not a limited resource but something that can be multiplied through sharing. The formal practice of mudita typically involves bringing to mind people who are experiencing some form of happiness, success, or good fortune, and deliberately cultivating joy in their well-being. We might think of a friend who received good news, a colleague who achieved something significant, or even a stranger who appears to be having a wonderful day. Rather than comparing their situation to our own or finding reasons to minimize their happiness, we intentionally focus on feeling glad for them. Like other heart practices in Buddhism, mudita is usually developed gradually, starting with people for whom it's relatively easy to feel happy, perhaps close friends or children whose joy naturally delights us. As the capacity strengthens, The practice extends to neutral people and eventually even to those we might typically envy or resent. This gradual approach honors the reality that mudita can be challenging, especially in a culture that often frames success and happiness in competitive, zero-sum terms. What makes mudita particularly powerful for emotional healing is that it directly transforms the painful experience of feeling diminished by others' good fortune. Many of us carry wounds related to not feeling enough, not successful enough, attractive enough, wealthy enough, or loved enough compared to others. These comparative wounds create a narrow, constricted emotional state where we're constantly measuring ourselves against others and usually coming up short. Mudita practice gradually relaxes this constriction by celebrating rather than resenting others' positive qualities and experiences. As we practice, we begin noticing how much more expansive and joyful it feels to delight in others' happiness compared to the contracted state of envy or resentment. This expansive quality creates a sense of abundance rather than scarcity, recognizing that we can appreciate infinite expressions of happiness, success, and beauty without needing to possess them all personally. For emotional wounds specifically, mudita helps heal the painful belief that we somehow deserve less happiness than others, or that our suffering is a personal failing while others lead charmed lives. The practice reminds us that happiness and suffering flow through all human lives in different measures and times. By celebrating others' moments of happiness, we affirm that we too are deserving of joy when it comes our way. The neurological benefits of mudita practice are significant. Research on positive emotions shows that experiencing joy activates reward centers in the brain and releases neurochemicals associated with well-being. Importantly, the brain doesn't distinguish between joy that comes from our own direct experience and joy we feel in response to others' happiness. Both create positive physiological changes. This means we can literally increase our experience of joy by celebrating the joy we witness in others, effectively multiplying opportunities for positive emotional states. Mudita practice also helps build resilience during difficult periods in our own lives. When we're struggling with loss, failure, or other challenges, the ability to take pleasure in others' happiness provides emotional nourishment that might otherwise be missing. Rather than feeling that we can only be happy when everything in our own life is perfect, we develop the capacity to access joy through our connection with others' experiences. This creates a more stable foundation for well-being that doesn't depend entirely on our personal circumstances. What many practitioners discover is that mudita doesn't just change how we feel about others' happiness, it gradually transforms how we relate to our own joy as well. The same critical, comparative mind that resents others' success often diminishes our own achievements and happiness, finding reasons why they're not enough or won't last. As mudita develops, we become more capable of simply enjoying positive experiences without the internal critic constantly qualifying or limiting our joy. Mudita practice can be integrated into daily life beyond formal meditation sessions. We might deliberately celebrate good news we hear about friends or colleagues rather than immediately comparing it to our situation. We can practice enjoying the simple happiness we witness in strangers, a child's delight in an ice cream cone, an elderly couple holding hands, someone receiving a phone call that makes them smile. These small moments of practiced joy gradually retrain the mind away from comparative suffering toward more spontaneous appreciation. For those healing from specific emotional wounds related to comparison, criticism, or never feeling enough, mudita offers a direct antidote. The person who grew up constantly being compared unfavorably to siblings or peers begins developing the capacity to celebrate others' qualities without feeling diminished. Someone who internalized harsh criticism learns to recognize and appreciate goodness and success without the reflexive need to find fault. The individual who never felt their achievements were sufficient begins celebrating accomplishments, both others and their own, without immediately devaluing them. What makes this practice especially powerful is that it works with positive emotion rather than just trying to reduce negative states. Many approaches to emotional healing focus primarily on processing difficult emotions or challenging negative thoughts. While these approaches have value, exclusively focusing on problems can sometimes inadvertently strengthen their grip. Mudita works by actively cultivating the opposite quality to comparative suffering, genuinely delighting in the good we witness. This positive focus creates new neural pathways and emotional habits rather than just trying to dismantle old ones. The capacity for mudita appears to be innate in humans but often gets covered over by competitive conditioning and comparative thinking. Young children naturally share in each other's excitement and joy before they learn to compare and compete. The practice isn't about creating something entirely new, but rather uncovering and strengthening a natural capacity that belongs to our basic humanity. This recognition can be healing in itself, realizing that the ability to feel joy beyond our personal circumstances is our birthright rather than some advanced spiritual achievement. As mudita develops through consistent practice, many people experience a profound shift in how they move through the world. Rather than constantly evaluating how they measure up against others, they discover the freedom of appreciating the infinite expressions of human flourishing without needing to rank or compare them. This shift doesn't just reduce suffering, it opens access to a vastly expanded field of potential joy available in every encounter with others' happiness and success. As mudita develops through consistent practice, many people experience a profound shift in how they move through the world. Rather than constantly evaluating how they measure up against others, they discover the freedom of appreciating the infinite expressions of human flourishing without needing to rank or compare them. This shift doesn't just reduce suffering, it opens access to a vastly expanded field of potential joy available in every encounter with others' happiness and success. This expansive approach to working with emotions reflects a core Buddhist principle known as upaya, or skillful means. This concept acknowledges that different emotional challenges require different approaches, and that wisdom involves knowing which technique to apply in each unique situation. Unlike rigid systems that prescribe the same solution for every problem, skillful means embraces flexibility and contextual awareness as essential to emotional healing. The Buddha himself was a master of skillful means, constantly adapting his teaching methods to match the specific needs, temperaments, and capacities of different individuals. Sometimes he taught through direct instruction, other times through questions, stories, or silence. This flexible approach reflected his understanding that people learn and heal in different ways depending on their unique conditioning and current state of mind. Applied to emotional healing specifically, skillful means suggests that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to working with difficult emotions or old wounds. What helps transform anger might be different from what helps with grief. What works during one phase of healing might not be appropriate during another. What supports one person's emotional regulation might overwhelm someone else. Recognizing this diversity of needs requires developing discernment rather than rigidly applying techniques regardless of context. This approach is particularly valuable because emotional wounds often involve complex layers that require different interventions at different times. Consider someone working with anxiety related to abandonment fears. At certain moments, they might need the grounding effect of breath awareness to regulate their nervous system. At other times, they might benefit from compassion practice to address the harsh self-criticism that often accompanies anxiety. Sometimes analytical reflection on the origins of these fears provides helpful perspective, while at other times such analysis might actually intensify rumination. Skillful means involves developing intuition about which approach serves healing in each moment. This intuition develops through practice and careful attention to results. We try different approaches and notice their effects, gradually refining our understanding of what works when. This experimental attitude prevents dogmatism about healing methods and keeps us responsive to our changing needs. The concept of skillful means incorporates both compassion and wisdom. Compassion motivates us to find whatever actually helps reduce suffering rather than insisting on ideologically pure approaches. wisdom helps us discern which method is most appropriate for each situation. Together, these qualities create an approach that's both kind and effective, avoiding both harsh pushing of ourselves and complacent acceptance of unnecessary suffering. One important aspect of skillful means for emotional regulation involves knowing when to work directly with a difficult emotion and when to temporarily shift attention elsewhere. Sometimes directly observing an emotion with mindful awareness is the most transformative approach. Other times, especially when emotions are overwhelming or when resources are depleted, deliberately focusing on neutral or positive experiences might be more skillful. This isn't avoidance but strategic resource building that creates better conditions for processing difficult material later. Similarly, skillful means helps us navigate when to use antidote practices versus direct observation. For some emotional states, cultivating the opposite quality provides balance, loving kindness for anger, appreciative joy for envy, equanimity for grasping attachment. In other situations, simply witnessing the emotion with spacious awareness allows its natural processing without needing to counter it directly. Discerning which approach serves healing in each case is the essence of skillful means. This flexible approach also helps us work wisely with the timing of emotional healing. Some emotional material is ready to be processed immediately, while other aspects might need to unfold more gradually. Forcing premature processing of traumatic material can sometimes re-traumatize rather than heal. Skillful means involve sensitivity to timing and readiness, neither pushing too fast nor unnecessarily delaying healing work when conditions are supportive. Many people discover that skillful means naturally develops through consistent mindfulness practice. As we become more familiar with our emotional patterns and their effects, we develop finer sensitivity to what's needed in each moment. We notice, for instance, when the mind is getting lost in analytical loops that intensify rather than release emotional tension. We recognize when the body needs movement to process emotional energy rather than still meditation. This growing self-knowledge becomes a form of emotional intelligence that guides our healing process. The concept of skillful means also applies to how we approach formal meditation practice itself. Different meditation techniques serve different purposes and may be more or less helpful depending on our current state. Focused concentration practices can help stabilize an agitated mind, while open awareness practices might help when the mind is dull or resistant. Body-based practices often help ground intense emotions, while heart practices like compassion and loving kindness directly address the emotional tone of experience. Skillful means involve selecting practices that address our current needs rather than mechanically applying the same technique regardless of circumstances. This flexible approach extends to how we engage with Buddhist teachings themselves. The Buddha described his teachings as being like a raft used to cross a river, useful for the journey but not something to carry once we've reached the other shore. This pragmatic attitude encourages us to use whatever aspects of Buddhist practice genuinely help our healing process without becoming attached to particular forms or techniques. The ultimate test is whether a practice reduces suffering and increases well-being, not whether it matches some predetermined idea of correct practice. What many practitioners discover through applying skillful means is that their relationship with the entire healing process becomes more fluid and responsive. Rather than seeing emotional healing as a linear path with fixed stages that everyone must follow in the same order, they recognize it as a dynamic process that unfolds uniquely for each person. This recognition prevents discouragement when healing doesn't match expectations and allows for genuine responsiveness to what's actually happening in each moment. Skillful means also helps us balance seemingly opposing approaches to emotional healing. Sometimes we need to directly confront and process difficult emotions. Other times we need to build positive resources and experiences. Sometimes analytical understanding of our patterns is helpful. Other times dropping into simple present moment awareness serves us better. Sometimes formal meditation practice is most supportive. Other times engagement in relationships or physical activities better facilitates emotional processing. Skillful Means embraces all these approaches as potentially valuable depending on context rather than elevating one method above all others. This balanced approach particularly helps those who have tried various healing methods without success. Often, the issue isn't that a particular method is wrong, but that it wasn't appropriate for that person's specific needs or current state. Understanding Skillful Means helps prevent discouragement by recognizing that finding effective approaches is an exploratory process rather than a one-time discovery. It encourages continued engagement with the healing journey while remaining flexible about which paths might best serve at different points. The development of Skillful Means represents a maturation in how we approach emotional healing. Rather than seeking quick fixes or perfect techniques, we develop a nuanced understanding of the complex interplay between different approaches and our unique needs. This maturation brings a quality of patience and trust to the healing process, not passive resignation but active engagement that respects the inherent intelligence of how healing unfolds when given appropriate support. This nuanced understanding of how to work with our emotions connects directly with one of Buddhism's most profound teachings about how suffering perpetuates itself and how it can be transformed. This teaching is Paticca Samuppada, or dependent origination, which explains how emotional patterns arise through interconnected conditions rather than simple cause and effect. Understanding this process gives us specific insights into how emotional cycles maintain themselves and, crucially, how they can be interrupted. The Buddha considered this teaching so important that he once said, "One who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma, truth, and one who sees the Dharma sees dependent origination." At its core, this teaching reveals that all experiences, including our emotional reactions and patterns, arise due to specific conditions coming together. When we understand these conditions clearly, we can work skillfully with them rather than feeling helpless in the face of seemingly automatic emotional reactions. In its traditional formulation, dependent origination is described through 12 interconnected links that explain how suffering arises and perpetuates itself. While this complete formulation offers profound insights, we can also apply the general principle to understand how specific emotional patterns become established and how they continue cycling. This practical application provides powerful tools for transforming even deeply entrenched emotional wounds. Consider how a typical emotional reaction unfolds. Something happens in our environment that we perceive through our senses. This perception triggers an immediate pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling tone. Based on this feeling, desire or aversion arises, wanting to hold on to pleasant experiences or push away unpleasant ones. This desire or aversion leads to various forms of grasping or pushing away, which then creates particular actions and their consequences. These consequences then set up conditions for similar patterns to repeat in the future. What makes this understanding so valuable for emotional healing is that it reveals multiple points where we can intervene in patterns that seem automatic or beyond our control. Rather than seeing emotional reactions as solid, unchangeable realities or as random occurrences, we recognize them as processes with specific components that we can work with. For example, someone with abandonment wounds might have a well-established pattern. Their partner is late coming home, external trigger. They perceive this as a potential sign of abandonment, perception. This creates unpleasant feeling tones in the body, sensation, which triggers fear and anger, emotional reaction, leading to accusatory behavior action, which creates tension in the relationship, consequence, further reinforcing the belief that relationships are unstable, strengthened pattern. Understanding this sequence reveals multiple intervention points. They might work with perception by questioning the automatic interpretation of lateness as abandonment. Practice staying present with uncomfortable bodily sensations without immediately reacting, or develop new behavioral responses when fear arises. The Buddha emphasized that these conditioned patterns operate whether we're aware of them or not. When we're unaware, we're essentially on automatic pilot, repeating patterns established through past conditioning without choice or freedom. Mindfulness practices help us become aware of these sequences as they unfold in real time, creating crucial space for new responses rather than automatic reactions. This space represents the possibility of freedom from even long-established emotional patterns. One particularly powerful insight from dependent origination is understanding how our perceptions and interpretations shape our emotional reactions. Two people can experience the same external event but react completely differently based on their conditioning and how they perceive what's happening. For emotional healing, this means that transforming how we perceive and interpret situations can fundamentally change our emotional responses, even when external circumstances remain the same. Another key intervention point involves working directly with the feeling tones that arise with experience, the immediate sense of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality that precedes full emotional reactions. By developing greater awareness of these feeling tones and learning to experience them without immediately grasping or pushing away, we interrupt the cycle before it gains momentum. This doesn't mean we don't feel anything, but rather that we don't automatically react to these feelings in ways that perpetuate suffering. Understanding dependent origination also helps us recognize how our current emotional patterns were conditioned by past experiences. The person who experienced childhood neglect developed particular perceptual filters and reactive patterns as adaptive responses to their environment. These patterns didn't arise randomly, but as conditioned responses to specific circumstances. This understanding helps reduce self-blame about emotional reactions, while also revealing how new conditions can lead to new patterns. Perhaps the most liberating aspect of this teaching is its revelation that nothing in our emotional experience has a solid, fixed, or permanent nature. What seems like an unchangeable aspect of our personality, "I've always been an anxious person," or "I just can't handle conflict," is actually a conditioned process that arose due to specific causes and conditions. This doesn't mean change happens instantly or easily, but it challenges the belief that some emotional patterns are permanent fixtures of who we are. The practical application of dependent origination involves bringing mindful awareness to our emotional patterns, particularly noticing the sequences that lead from initial triggers to full emotional reactions and behaviors. Through consistent observation, we start recognizing recurring patterns and identifying where we might intervene most effectively. And for some patterns, changing our environment or reducing exposure to triggers might be most helpful. For others, working with our perceptions and interpretations creates more freedom. Sometimes addressing the physical sensations that accompany emotions helps interrupt automatic reactions. This detailed observation of emotional patterns serves a purpose beyond just understanding them intellectually. It gradually reveals their constructed nature, how what seemed like solid, inevitable reactions are actually processes unfolding through multiple steps, none of which is fixed or unchangeable. This insight doesn't just give us more choices in how we respond, it fundamentally shifts our relationship to the emotional patterns themselves. Rather than seeing them as defining truths about who we are, we recognize them as conditioned processes that can change as conditions change. The understanding of dependent origination brings particular hope for those dealing with deeply entrenched emotional wounds. Even patterns that have operated for decades aren't fixed or permanent. They continue because specific conditions continue to support them. When we change these conditions through consistent practice and awareness, even the most stubborn patterns can gradually transform. This perspective prevents both the fatalism that says we can never change and the impatience that expects instant transformation of lifelong patterns. What many practitioners discover through working with this teaching is a profound sense of freedom that doesn't depend on eliminating all difficult emotions or achieving some perfect state. Instead, freedom comes through understanding the conditioned nature of our emotional reactions and developing the awareness that allows us to relate to them differently. We still experience the full range of human emotions, but we're no longer completely identified with them or driven by them in the same unconscious ways. This freedom within our emotional experience rather than from it, represents the heart of what Buddhist practice offers for emotional healing.